Time moved inexorably forward. It was 5 to 12 on the big wall clock. Drawing everyone's attention, the teacher announced that there were 10 minutes left in the English exam. One of the students, a young man with ashy hair and a gray shirt, was thinking nervously. A blank sheet of paper lay in front of him. His neighbor had the same problem. He puzzledly asked the young man who now had the cribs. The young man worriedly replied that the exam answers should have been brought by Lin Tian. The interlocutor grudgingly muttered that Lin Tian had really let them down just when his help was needed. The young man they were talking about didn't even think about helping his classmates. He was sleeping serenely on his desk. A poorly dressed young man was walking down the street. Even though he had already studied at university, he only had enough money to buy Vietnamese shoes. He didn't even have a bag or backpack. He used a red cellophane bag to carry his notebooks. Lin Tian would usually hook the bag on his belt and calmly walk to the university, completely unconcerned about his appearance. The young man considered himself lucky already because he could afford to eat and drink daily. Even the vendor was surprised that Lin Tian only bought plain white rice and didn't want to know about other food. On such occasions, the young man would proudly spread his chest and shoulders and say that he had absolutely no money for it. His extreme poverty and appearance always caused a lot of discussion. Students would sneakily say that he couldn't even buy food. However, Lin Tian himself was not bothered by this at all. He called himself a fashionista and asked why people were looking at him like that. He used to be really poor. But on the day he retook his English exam, everything changed in a different direction. The teacher woke up the young man and told him that he might be expelled. Lin Tian had a blank slate. He didn't answer any questions. The young man opened his eyes and replied in a sleepy voice that he had a full 10 more minutes to spare. The instructor couldn't help but laugh. Everyone knows that this is a negligible amount of time. She said that Tian wouldn't have time for anything. The teacher was fed up with the retake. She shouted that today's students on the exam were simply preventing others from studying. The woman slapped the blank sheet angrily. She exclaimed that the answers to exam questions do not appear in the sky by themselves. Lin Tian couldn't hold back a smile. He looked at the teacher as if he was a child who didn't understand simple things. The young man admitted that this was exactly what he was counting on. Within 10 minutes, the answers would appear in the sky. At that moment, something really whistled through the sky. The tree outside the window wobbled and lost several dozen leaves. A wide white ribbon cluttered half the window. Red letters marked the correct answers to the test. In fact, it was actually Lin Tian's accomplices who were to blame. They used a helicopter to throw away that answer tape. The teacher was furious. No doubt it was the cheat sheet. But the cheat sheet was outside the window, and there was nothing she could do. Now absolutely all the students stood up and watched in amazement as the helicopter slowly lifted their test answers upward. Lin Tian immediately started writing the correct answers. His sleep was gone. He had to be done in 10 minutes. The young man cheerfully shouted to his classmates that they shouldn't be slacking off either. It was better to hurry up and write it off while there was still time. All the other sloths were very satisfied. They unanimously started shouting that Lin Tian had a very good idea. Thus, even before the deadline expired, Lin Tian placed the written piece of paper to the teacher on the desk. The woman didn't know what to say. The young man smiled and cheerfully said goodbye to his classmates. The teacher couldn't stand it. She shouted that she was fed up with it and the students should stop cheating. She shouted at Tian's back that those students who cheat on an exam don't get a single point for retaking it. Meanwhile, a red helicopter flew up to the window and one of the pilots yelled out that it was done. They wanted their money. Lin Tian clapped himself on the head. He had completely forgotten about this. The young man opened the classroom window and took out a red bag. The distance to the helicopter was pretty decent, so it was necessary to climb higher. Tian jumped onto the windowsill. The helicopter came a little closer. The young man swung as hard as he could and threw the red bag into the cockpit of the helicopter. The bag was filled to the top with bank stacks of banknotes. Lin Tian shouted that there was more than enough. He didn't need change. The pilot counted out his money and threw the bag back into the classroom. The red banknotes flew around the school grounds. A lot of 100 banknotes flew into the classroom. The school children were very happy about the rain of money. They had all already forgotten about the exam test and rushed to the window to collect money. Tian smiled. He was satisfied. The teacher was stunned. She had never seen such a huge sum at once. The exam was out of her head. As if mocking, Lin Tian threw a handful of green leaves in the woman's face and informed her that he still had to catch the school bus. Lin Tian walked out of the school building and heaved a sigh of relief. Implementing this idea had been difficult, but he had succeeded. The explanation was simple. The system implanted in his mind required him to spend 150,000 yuan in cash during the exam. The young man was in a very good mood. Smiling to himself, he remembered that Tianjin's spending system had appeared a week ago. That day, the young man stood in line at an ATM. It seemed like an eternity had passed, but the queue was still moving. Back then, Lin Tian was still quite poor, and it was difficult for him to save money. There were only 200 yuan in the small bag. Moreover, it was the entire salary for a whole month's work. The sight of such money brought tears to my eyes. The sum was so insignificant that even a robber would have turned away scornfully and not risked it in vain. Like a roll of thunder, a pistol shot rumbled from behind. The whole line screamed in panic. Upon entering the self-service bank, one of the masked men announced that a robbery was in progress and demanded everyone get down on the floor. Ling Tian turned pale. After all, these were just thoughts out loud. He had no idea that anyone would be robbed. The second robber ran up to the other line where the young man was standing and ordered everyone to sit on the floor and not move. The broken bank glass and a few armed men were frightening, and most people were just in floods of tears. Lin Tian was the only one acting restless. He furtively looked around and wondered how he could escape from the bank. No one was looking at him, and the young man put his hand behind his back. One of the men who was standing behind him took notice. He angrily asked the young man what he was going to do. Ling Tian turned pale. He was sure that no one had seen him. The situation was made worse by the fact that he had a gun to his head. It felt like a real gun. However, Ling Tian quickly thought of a reason, and exclaimed that he just had an itch below his back. In fact, he couldn't afford to lose even 200 yuan. That was exactly what Lin Tian had been transferring into his back pocket. The man didn't believe him, and only poked him harder with his gun. He was ready to shoot. He didn't need any heroes in the bank. Fortunately, at that moment someone from the other end of the hall gave a shrill shout, and the robber let his guard down. Ling Tian smiled. He had a very rare chance to escape for a situation like this, and he should take it. Carefully and slowly, the young man began to rise from the floor. The robber was busy and paid no attention to him. It turned out that one of the raiders spotted a pretty girl in line and could not pass by. She squealed when the man grabbed her arm. The girl with the glasses squinted her eyes and exclaimed angrily that the robber might not even think about it. One of the robbers rebuked his comrade, nicknamed Mouse, that they had come to rob a bank, not to molest girls. Trying to justify himself, Mouse replied that he just couldn't help himself. This girl was too beautiful to pass by. The girl's eyes glazed over. She exclaimed that she would rather die than be with a scoundrel like him. In this commotion, no one paid any attention to Ling Tian, and he reached the emergency switch unhindered. When he opened the doors of the bank, the young man was relieved to breathe fresh air, and for a reason he did not understand himself, he stopped. Mouse couldn't calm down and reached for the girl's blouse. She shrieked, and it was disgusting. Ling Tian returned to the bank and demanded that his class teacher, Miss Chen, be released immediately. At this, the young man smiled and did not forget to add that it was better to rob Miss Chen if it was only about money. The robber pointed a gun at his chest with lightning speed and angrily asked when the young man had time to open the door. Not realizing the gravity of the situation, Ling Tian slowly walked closer and suggested that we just talk. The flash from the muzzle of the gun blinded the young man. It was the last thing he saw in his short life. The bullet pierced the guy's torso. His knees started buckling. The murder happened at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. There were only seconds left to live. Ling Tian couldn't bear the thought that it was over and he was dying. He remembered that he had 200 yuan left in his pocket that he never had time to deposit into his bank account. His greatest desire now was to at least spend this hard-earned money. Suddenly, something seemed to light up the hall. The system was offering the young man the chance to escape death for completing a task. The robber with a gun approached the young man and stared at him suspiciously. It seemed to him that Ling Tian was up to something. The man put the gun to the young man's head and angrily asked what it was he was going to do. Tian took a surprised look at the situation. It turned out that the young man had gone back 3 minutes, and the events had unfolded exactly the same way. So he did get his chance. Ling Tian immediately remembered his teacher and her scream that would resound in a moment. He also remembered what would happen later. Lin Tian frowned. He would die if he didn't find a way to use 1 million in 3 minutes. That was what the system told him to do. The robber looked intently at the young man. He was not like the other visitors, who immediately fell face down to the floor. He shouted that there was nothing to stare at his face, and if the young man looked at him again, he would be shot. Ling Tian became angry. He was the only one in this room who knew that the robber had already shot at him, and even killed him. Stammering at gunpoint, the young man began to mutter something to himself. The robber could not make out a word. He got angry and yelled that they didn't have time to play games, so the young man should stop mumbling and tell it like it is. Carelessly pointing his hand towards Mouse, Lin Tian informed the robber that that guy had dropped the money and he wanted to mention it. Mouse was extremely surprised. He did not know any money, and there was no way it could have fallen out of his pockets. The robber poked the young man incredulously with his pistol and demanded to be shown exactly what money had fallen out of the accomplice's pocket. Mouse eyed the young man suspiciously. He didn't like the whole thing. There were hostages behind him. Passing by his teacher, Miss Chen, Lin Tian couldn't resist and winked cheerfully at her. The girl was surprised. Of course, she recognized her student at once. It was unclear what the young man was doing in the bank and what he was up to. Approaching Mouse, Ling Tian informed him in a confident voice that he had dropped the money he had tied to his leg. Mouse was surprised. At that moment, $100 bills spilled out from under his pant leg in front of everyone. The robber with the gun became angry. It was now quite clear that Mouse was trying to hide some of the loot. The young man laughed and said that this guy had to use his own pants to carry the money. Mouse was indignant. It was the first time he had ever seen that money. Mouse exclaimed that he had nothing to do with that money. Ling Tian suggested finding a bag. After all, the filled pants were unlikely to hold more than a few thousand yuan. Mouse kept yelling that he was being slandered and it wasn't his money. He suggested it was some kind of trick. Ling Tian smiled and reported that it was fine. In fact, he's just a good guy and helps everyone. The young man took the teacher's hand, hinting that he was asking her to come upstairs. He informed her that nothing would be hidden from the boss. Ling Tian loudly reported that this girl had no choice. She perplexedly asked in a whisper what he was up to. Ling Tian asked the girl to act less suspicious and just play along with him. He knows perfectly well what to do. The young man held his fist behind Miss Chen's back and none of the robbers could see what he was doing. As if by magic, a weighty wad of banknotes appeared in the young man's half-clenched fist. Demonstrating it to the raiders, Ling Tian reported that the girl had been forced to hide the money for another guy. All the robbers were surprised. In fact, the user of the system could choose the location and the amount of money himself. The mugger who was pointed at this time began to panic. Like Mouse, he didn't understand a thing. The boss angrily exclaimed that they had always been unscrupulous, so now they had decided to grab more for themselves. Mouse shouted resentfully that they would never have thought of such a thing. They always try, and the boss is suspicious of them. The man pulled out a gun and pointed it at Mouse. He assumed that the money had come out of thin air if no one had taken it. Ling Tian smugly thought that everything was going according to plan. The boss reacted as befitting his status. The young man shouted that in fact the robber boss was wrong too. He pointed his finger to the far corner and everyone looked there. There was a small pile of bank bill wrappers in the corner near the vase. It was clear that the boss was dirty too. Mouse got excited about this and wailed that Lu Haoping wasn't a little better. He was withholding money from the rest of the gang. Now the boss was even more angry. Under no circumstances were real names to be mentioned. He vowed to kill Mouse. The shot rang out so loudly that everyone in the room was almost deafened. Smoke slowly drifted from the man's gun. It didn't take long for the answer to come. One of the robbers fired back. Another of the robbers shot his partner. Bleeding, one of the men with a gun in his hands made a muffled sound and fell to the floor. There was so much firing that the room was filled with smoke and smoke. Tian and Chen hid in a secluded place. A few minutes passed, and the sounds of gunfire died down. The smoke began to clear a little. The young man looked at the battlefield with interest. Several people were lying on the floor in pools of blood. They were moaning in death agony, and it was clear that they were no longer tenants. While hugging Miss Chen, the young man remembered that it wasn't over yet. Out of the million, there was still another 100,000 to spend. The young man glanced quickly at his watch. There was less than a minute left until 4 o'clock. In that time, he should spend the required amount of money. Suddenly, someone put a gun to the young man's head, and he had to break away from the disturbing and intrusive thoughts. Coincidentally, the gang boss managed to survive. He shouted that the young man was to blame for all of this and must therefore die. Ling Tian looked at the man fearfully. Time was inexorably passing, and the gang boss was serious and ready to shoot. The class leader, Miss Chen, was seriously scared for her student. He was in mortal danger. The girl shouted that Ling Tian should worry for his life, and pushed the young man away, covering him with her body. The robber had his finger on the hook, and every second he could shoot, his nerves were getting the best of him. Miss Chen was not afraid of death at all. Moreover, as a good teacher, she was willing to accept death instead of her student. The bank customers screamed in horror. No one wanted to see this pretty girl killed right in front of their eyes. The robber hesitated a moment. The girl was really nothing, and there was no need to harm her. Miss Chen was very surprised herself. She assumed that the raider was shocked by her sense of justice. Whatever it was, the girl was ready for her fate. She closed her eyes and told herself she had no regrets. A gunshot sounded. To her surprise, Miss Chen realized that something strange was happening. She wasn't in any pain at all. She opened her eyes in surprise and looked around. There really wasn't a scratch on her body, and the boy was alive too. Looking down, the girl realized everything. Her body was securely covered by bank bundles of money, and scraps from the banknotes were flying in the air. Closer inspection revealed that the bullet had hit right in the center of the soft banknote shield and lodged in it. The raider couldn't believe his eyes. Everything going on in the bank was very strange, and it looked like the kid was involved too. It was already like a taunt and made the robber even angrier. He raised his gun and fired again. At the same second, the firearm exploded into pieces. Shreds of red bills flew all over the room. The raider wailed that his eyes were injured and grasped them with bloody hands. His clothes were torn. Ling Tian exclaimed as the robber's gun exploded. This could be called fair karma without a doubt. He was the only one who knew what had happened. At his will, the money was in the gun, and it was torn in the gunman's hands when the shot was fired. Miss Chen delicately asked the young man to move his hand away from her. She wasn't quite comfortable feeling the guy's hand. Ling Tian looked around perplexedly. It turned out that his hand was on Miss Chen's chest for some reason, and she was uncomfortable. Ling Tian immediately retracted his hand and politely apologized. He pretended that he didn't understand how it happened at all. The young man turned aside and imagined himself continuing to touch the girl's breasts. It was very pleasant for him. Unfortunately, when he wanted to take the money provided by the system, it melted into the air at his touch. The young man almost cried. So much money, but he can't take a single banknote. The system has cheated him. Suddenly, the doors of the bank opened and several police officers led by an officer entered the premises. A very strange picture appeared before their eyes. There were several dead bodies and a pile of banknotes scattered on the floor, and a guy and a girl who were standing in the middle of all this mess. Apparently, they were not surprised at all. The police officer looked around the scene of the massacre in surprise and inquired about the room. Ling Tian called her aunt and said that he had to go to work and let her deal with it because she was entitled to her status. The girl officer with the fiery hair looked thoughtfully at the young man carelessly strolling off into the distance. He had a couple $100 bills sticking carelessly out of his back pocket, and the officer suspected the young man had stolen them. Such insolence the girl couldn't tolerate, and she asked the young man to stop. Ling Tian walked on. Remembering that she was an officer after all, the girl demanded to stop and explain why he called her aunt. The girl had only recently graduated from the academy. The next day, Ling Tian went to school. Their school building was in a green area, and it was interesting to look at everything from the window. Right now, it was the class teacher's lesson. Miss Chen was enthusiastically reading the outline to the group. Suddenly, she noticed that Ling Tian was brazenly sprawled on the desk, and was also snoring at the same time as if he was at home. The teacher walked over to the young man and sternly called out to him. Ling Tian didn't even think of waking up. He was having a good dream. One of his classmates twirled a pencil between his fingers and said carelessly that that beggar was sleeping in class again. Ling Tian started to stir and barely opened his sleepy eyes. He couldn't understand where he was at the moment at all. Miss Chen couldn't stand it and shouted at him while holding the synopsis in her hand. She hoped to get him out of this habit as soon as possible. The first thing Lin Tai saw upon his awakening was the teacher's impressive breasts hidden under her blouse. Miss Chen asked him to concentrate on the lesson. Only then did the young man shift his gaze higher and look at her face. He laughed and said he hadn't noticed he'd fallen asleep. He assumed it was because of yesterday's part-time job after school. One of the classmates suggested that the beggar would now be punished, because all students know that it is not allowed to argue with the teacher. Meanwhile, Miss Chen remembered that yesterday she had clung to the young man with fear. Lin Tian had hugged her tenderly at that time. She blushed with embarrassment and turned the other way, saying she forgave his antics, but only once. Unfortunately, the girl was in such a hurry to get away so quickly that she didn't notice and tore her pantyhose a little below her miniskirt. Ling Tian immediately woke up at the sight of the exposed piece of leg. His eyes were filled with excitement and his mouth drooled. Meanwhile, the classmates were heatedly discussing the beggar and the teacher. One of them told his neighbor that he should have been punished. The other boy was of the same opinion, but he did not say anything yet. He watched the beggar thoughtfully. Suddenly, a news notification came to his phone. Their beggar was all over the page. Turns out he'd rescued the hostages at the bank yesterday and called the police. The red-haired classmate couldn't believe their beggar could be capable of such a thing, and he had no business in a bank. At that moment, a large loudspeaker signaled the end of the lesson. All the students came out for recess. Before Lin Tian could get up from his seat, a female classmate in a short skirt sat on the desk in front of him and stared at him intently. A girl in jean shorts and a bright yellow t-shirt stopped on the other side of the desk. The third girl asked if it was true what they wrote about him saving the hostages. According to the first girl's version, Tian had already become a martial arts master. The girl in the miniskirt wanted an answer and asked, wiggling her foot, if that news could be believed. Such an abundance of women's bodies was maddening. The young man's eyes widened, and he agreed with everything that was said about him. Suddenly his joy was over. One of his classmates came by and suggested a celebration. The red-haired young man said that Tian would have to treat everyone to dinner, as he was now the truest star. The other classmate said he agreed. Otherwise, Tian simply won't be able to cement his status as a big star. The girl in the miniskirt jumped at the idea and asked the young man to call all of his classmates for dinner. The girl in shorts turned around to add her own wish. Unfortunately, the boy was already gone. Ling Tian was furtively rounding the corner of the classroom at this time. He told himself that no one had the right to demand money from him. Suddenly, Ling Tian heard some strange sound and became alert. Putting his ear against the wall, he began to listen. His classmate just laughed and said that the young man cannot be called a star because he is a beggar, and in addition, ran away. Suddenly the young man was forced to interrupt his speech. Someone behind him put a hand on his shoulder. The red-haired boy turned around in surprise. He wondered who in the school had the nerve to do such a thing. As it turned out, it was the same beggar who had just dared to run away. He smiled and said he was in the dining room. The young boy looked at him perplexed. The beggar cheerfully exclaimed to the whole class that he was inviting everyone to dinner in the dining room. Ling Tian was truly overjoyed. The assignment from the system had come at an extraordinary time. Moreover, it coincided with the needs of his classmates. Ling Tian raised his hand with the bag up and loudly announced that he was inviting the entire class to the dining hall for dinner tonight. The red-haired classmate thought he had misheard at first. The phrase about dinner in the dining hall for classmates sounded strange. The other two classmates immediately raised Tian to laugh. One of them laughed and told the other that Tian didn't know any other places. Ignoring their retorts, Lin Tian proudly said that he was treating them to dinner, so he was inviting the entire class. Without waiting for an answer, the young man threw his hand up in the air and announced that they were going to the dining room right now. Their siblings were invited as well. One of the girls said that she had always wanted to try fried mangoes. The other girl said that the canteen had plenty to eat. The red-haired youth walked up to Lin Tian and stared at him. He said that he wasn't going to eat in the dining hall at all. Everyone around him giggled. Ling Tian assumed that his classmate was just afraid of embarrassing himself, but didn't want to admit it. The redhead called over two of his loyal classmates, and they retreated to the far corner of the classroom to discuss the situation. The young man with blue hair would be willing to sacrifice himself and told Boss Jiang that he would easily go to that dinner instead. Jiang was angry. He shouted that he had never heard such nonsense in his life and kicked the young man he had betrayed in the back. Jiang was beyond angry. He ordered a second classmate to tell the others to all come to the dining hall today. The young man assumed that Jiang wanted revenge. The red-haired man smirked sinisterly and said that he would just stomp on him. At the appointed time, all the students gathered in front of a large, bright room. The sign said it was the student canteen. Through the large, bright window, everyone could see Lin Tian. One of the classmates was incredulous about Tian's idea to treat the group. His interlocutor laughed. According to him, the conversation wasn't just about their group. Lin Tian had invited the entire university. The young man pondered for a moment. Lin Tian must have overreacted. It was as if his recent fame had turned his head. At that moment, a booming voice sounded from behind. A man in a white shirt demanded to clear the way. The companions immediately looked around. There was a sign attached to the man's white shirt that read, Jiang Hao's Restaurant. This explained a lot of things. Jiang Hao himself smiled and said that he would treat everyone to dinner. A team of waiters lined up beside him. A van with a trailer pulled up to the cafeteria building and stopped. The side of the trailer began to slowly rise up. It turned out that there was a professional kitchen on wheels. The cook started cooking the required dishes immediately. 6 waiters lined up near the mobile kitchen. Each of them was ready to serve the visitors quickly. Jiang's henchman exclaimed that the food here was better than the canteen. The chef of the 5-star restaurant came in person. A few students watched the cooking enthusiastically. It looked so much better than their canteen. One of the classmates exclaimed that Jiang Hao was a very generous person and was heartily treating them all. The blue-haired young man caustically remarked that Jiang was different from beggars who actually pretend to be generous with this. Ling Tian realized that this phrase was referring to him and turned around. Jiang Hao laughed and put his thumb down. Even the pretty girls who had recently been sticking it to Tian asked him unhesitatingly if they could eat at Jiang Hao's place. The second girl told her friend that she was just starving and they should get something to eat. They would come back later and support the young man. Ling Tian sighed heavily and exclaimed that it was not worth spending so much money in their time. It was an unnecessary expense. At that moment, the young man's cell phone in the bag rang. Even the phone screen was cracked. There was no money to replace it. Apologizing, the caller said that it took some time to prepare the food he had ordered. Ling Tian was happy about that as well. Seeing that Ling Tian was worriedly talking to someone on the phone, Jiang Hao couldn't contain his smile. The young man laughed smugly and lifted his head up. His smile faded immediately. Something incredible was happening. His friends followed his boss's example and looked up into the sky. His friends followed his boss's lead and looked up at the sky. Several shipping containers were descending from the sky on giant parachutes. There could be only one reason for their appearance. Meanwhile, the other students also saw huge containers falling from the sky. Everyone was curious about what was inside them. A long-legged girl landed on one of the huge parachutes. In both hands she held a cook in each of her collars. The girl landed softly. Her lacquered boots with their fancy red soles shone brightly even on a sunny day. The parachutist carefully placed the cooks on the ground and unhooked her equipment. Now they were ready to work. The brown-haired chef shook off and adjusted his starched chef's hat on his head. All three were standing right at the door of the huge container and ready to begin a show no one had ever seen before. After some brief manipulation, the container door began to slowly ajar and slid down smoothly. Everyone saw that the container contained a huge refrigerator and lots of vegetables, canned goods, and other food. The classmates thought it was Jiang's job. He ordered more food just in case. One of the classmates admiringly told Jiang that he could have warned about such a show in advance instead of making it a secret. Jiang Hao himself was completely unable to understand what was going on. All he had planned to do was to make a dinner out of the mobile kitchen. Meanwhile, a young man with blue hair was praising Jiang and asking everyone to line up. Jiang Hao tensely thought. His second younger brother could have done this, and the young man certainly deserved to be promoted. Smiling, Jiang turned to everyone and loudly announced that he'd just like to make everyone happy. He had enough money. Jiang Hao walked over to the girl who had landed and smiled politely at her. He offered his hand and tried to introduce himself to her. To the young man's surprise, the golden-haired beauty slapped his face with the back of her palm without a word. Stretching, Lin Tian informed the team that they had taken too long to get there. After all, he had offered to double the price. The girl bowed and apologized for being late. Her name is Cicely, she's the manager. Tian can call her Celie. The young man twisted the name slightly and asked Xiao Li to start cooking. Everyone was already getting quite hungry. The girl embarrassedly covered her eyes and smiled. Lin Tian called her Junior and acknowledged that she was very beautiful. The young man handed Xiao Li a bottle and asked him to pour drinking water and prepare 2 bowls of rice for him as well. Without waiting for an answer, the young man turned around in the other direction. Xiao Li didn't understand how one could have small requests with such money. The students excitedly murmured. It was now clear to everyone that Lin Tian was originally a rich man after all. An airplane with a kitchen cost a lot of money. Only Jiang Hao walked with his head down. After looking at him, his classmate motioned for his interlocutor to go to the dining hall. Jiang Hao was indignant. Lin Tian had just made him look ridiculous. The young man couldn't believe that Tian had gone against him. He shouted loudly that everyone could summon containers from the air. In fact, the cook plays the most important role. Jiang Hao continued to blurt out that his personal chefs were known all over the world. One of them respectfully bowed his head. Smiling, Jiang exclaimed that one of his chefs was cooking in the best 5-star restaurant in the country, and Tian was far from that. Suddenly, the same cook from the 5-star restaurant called someone a master, and Jiang perplexedly turned around. His best cook knelt by the newcomer and tearfully begged him to teach him. He declared that he had made some progress. The cook contemptuously reminded the man that he worked in a 5-star restaurant, and yet he dared to ask for help. Jiang couldn't stand it, and yelled that he would fire him if the cook didn't come back to him. The cook replied that the most important thing for him was to learn from the master. Ling Tian enjoyed watching this scene. He politely coughed into his fist and said that he was already hungry. The cook bowed and assured that he would get to work right away. He just needed a little more time. Jiang Hao realized that everything was now lost to him. He had lost his face not only among the students but also among his staff. Jiang looked hatefully at the back of Lin Tian, who was lazily sipping surrounded by the best chefs in the world. He was so angry that it was necessary to find a victim immediately. Jiang grabbed one of his friends and demanded to know how much he had gotten from Tian. Jiang kicked the young man in the back and asked him not to mess with him anymore. The young man with blue hair couldn't understand what the reason was. Jiang angrily called out to Lin Tian and offered to see together what his culinary savages could do. Lin Tian collapsed on the stool in anticipation. Xiao Li brought out a platter and said that the first salad was ready. The young man exclaimed indignantly that he didn't need any salad at all. A bowl of rice was enough for him. The girl smiled politely. Ling Tian himself didn't know what he was giving up, and he should have explained everything in more detail. Xiao Li lifted the lid of the dish, and a dazzling yellow light struck from there. The girl urged her to try the dish. From the looks of it, this dish looked too poor for the distinguished cooks. A small cabbage leaf floated in a spoonful of oil. Jiang Hao laughed and said loudly that it didn't look like a salad at all, just an ordinary cabbage leaf. But their classmate thought otherwise. She embarrassedly pressed herself against Tian and whispered in his ear that the salad was divine. Ling Tian remarked in surprise that the cabbage was indeed very tasty, but still one should not exaggerate its value. Xiao Li smiled indulgently and offered to take a closer look at what they called cabbage. In fact, the entire cabbage leaf is created from different colored truffles using a molecular cooking technique. Ling Tian indulgently pinched a piece of the dish and declared that it was delicious and looked a little better than the canteen. This phrase simply killed everyone present. Even the delicacy for the young man was a little better than in the canteen. Xiao Li immediately brought a few more dishes into the hall. One of the girls said that they looked like canteen food. For example, among the dishes offered, one was like a free soup without butter, but was made with boiled water and cabbage. or rare white asparagus with an endangered species of pork, and another fish-flavored pork flavored with saffron, as well as the usual scrambled eggs with honey-glazed specialty tomatoes and spherical fish meat. The classmates had to admit that Lin Tian had organized everything much better than the arrogant Zhang Hao. Zhang Hao, meanwhile, stood to the side and was saddened by his fall. The young man couldn't believe that he had lost to Lin Tian. Xiao Li smiled dazzlingly and asked Lin Tian if he was satisfied with the quality of the food he had cooked. Without embarrassing anyone, the young man loudly belched air and said that there was only one thing he didn't like. The water was too cold. The girl smiled and replied that it was fine, because it was spring water delivered straight from the snowy mountain. Xiao Li said that she had to return the remaining money and held out an elite bank card to the young man. Ling Tian angrily slammed his palm on the table, quite surprising everyone else with his behavior. He angrily shouted that he didn't need the money. Xiao Li could spend it on the most expensive handbags and cosmetics. One of her classmates was looking at the young man with rapt attention. He seemed more and more handsome by the minute. After completing the task, a crying Lin Tian walked away. He really wanted to have a bigger stomach and eat more food. The system confirmed the task had been completed and reported the launch of a lottery with randomized organ enhancement. Ling Tian couldn't understand anything. He didn't ask for anything. The young man pleaded that he didn't accidentally have his appendix enlarged. After making several revolutions around the improvised drum, the arrow finally stopped. The choice had been made. Ling Tian looked around. Nothing was happening. He didn't understand what kind of systemic improvement he was talking about. Suddenly, the young man realized everything. He looked at Xiao Li with completely different eyes. Now he could see her in her underwear at once. Ling Tian shifted his gaze to his classmates. The X-ray vision was working perfectly, and the young man was pleased with this gift. Suddenly, Xiao Li fearfully called out to the young man. The female classmates also looked at him excitedly. The blue-eyed beauty Xiao Li leaned over Tian and worriedly inquired what had happened to him. The young man himself could not stand the sight of half-naked female bodies, and he developed a severe nosebleed. After the incident in the canteen, Lin Tian became even more famous. A police officer became interested in him and came to the university. The bank robbery case was closed quickly, but the girl felt that there was something else. She decided to meet the young man. Suddenly, the officer saw a group of students moving towards her. All of them had the exact same bags as Lin Tian. The girl walked closer to them and asked them to stay for a while. She wanted to ask a couple of simple questions. The young men turned toward her. One of them asked the officer's aunt what had happened and how they could help. The girl blushed red with anger and said that she did not look like an old woman. Her name is Zhou Wei Wei. You can at least call her sister. The young men laughed. Indeed, the girl in front of them was pretty and looked not much older. Wei Wei said cautiously that she had seen such bags before. She asked if they were common at the university. One of them said that it was now fashionable. The other added that Master Lin had started walking around with such a bag and called her little sister. Hearing the familiar name, the girl gave it some serious thought. She hoped it was just a rich kid's prank. The girl's face flushed with anger. She only now realized the words of the guy she had been talking to. Wei Wei angrily demanded that he stop immediately. He had absolutely no right to call her sis. Suddenly, the officer discovered her target. Ling Tian was standing in a circle of female classmates. It was as if they were all hanging around his neck. Wei couldn't believe her luck. She didn't even have to walk around and ask around for a long time. She found the young man right away. Ling Tian felt rather strange. It turned out that all three of his assignments were training assignments, and now there was a real assignment to be done. One of the girls resentfully said that Master Lin was just ignoring her, and informed her that once again, she wanted to have a good meal. Ling Tian was too busy. This time the system had a penalty for not completing the task. The second classmate snuggled up to the young man and whispered languorously in his ear that she would be alone in the room tonight. Wei Wei couldn't believe her eyes, but everything really indicated that Master Lin was Lin Tian. It all looked too weird. He was barefoot in the cheapest flip-flops he could find. They're just plain cheap brown pants. There's a supermarket bag dangling from his belt, nothing expensive. Even the green t-shirt's a little worn, collar's a little loose. According to the police investigation, the guy's very poor. He has to work and go to classes at the university at the same time. Even the wristwatch is purchased from the children's department. Wei Wei pondered, trying to piece together all the information about the young man. A poor student could hardly be such a success with girls. Suddenly, she realized everything. Before the robbery, Lin Tian was just an ordinary guy, and then he got rich. He was clearly involved in this. Wei Wei ran up to Lin Tian and demanded the young man to stop immediately. She was sure that she had picked up the trail. Lin Tian didn't see or hear anyone at all at that moment. The system offered to choose the difficulty of the task. The young man decided that it would be best to choose an easy mode to complete the task, and then he wouldn't lose anything. As luck would have it, it was at this very moment that a police officer was running up to the young man. For some reason, she was sure that Lin was running away. Wei Wei slapped the young man's shoulder with all her might. She exclaimed that they just needed to talk about the case. It wasn't until the moment of tremor that Ling Tian realized with horror that the irreparable was happening, but nothing could be changed. Coincidentally, Wei Wei had whipped his arm, and the young man had chosen the hardest level of the task instead of the easiest. Ling Tian lowered his head and dejectedly told himself, closing his eyes, that it was over. There was nothing he would be able to do. Wei Wei understood him in her own way. She even felt sorry for the young man. She said that it was really over for him. Lin Tian seemed as if he only now noticed the presence of the police officer. He looked at the girl in surprise. In the next second, the young man snapped out of his seat and rushed to run. He shouted that he had to go. Time was running out. Wei Wei turned red with anger. But the young man told the truth. He only had 6 hours to complete the task. As punishment for not completing the assignment, the young man would lose his language skills, and that was far more frightening than the police officer. Checking his watch, Ling Tian determined that he only had until 8 o'clock in the evening. The young man was rushing faster than the wind. He told himself that this was enough. No one could stop him from spending the money. Suddenly, Ling Tian realized that something wrong was happening. He stopped feeling the solid ground under his feet. Turns out, it was the valiant officer Wei Wei who was to blame. She caught up with the young man and tried to throw him over herself. During their fight in the air, Ling Tian accidentally caught the girl's chest, and Wei Wei was confused. The girl was very embarrassed and for that reason lost her balance. The moment she landed on the ground, Wei stumbled. By the time the officer realized that too much of her attention had gone to the casual touch, it was too late. The girl couldn't hold on and fell right on top of the young man. He was less fortunate as he fell on his back. Barely opening one eye, Ling Tian tried to look around. His entire body ached from the fall, and he groaned in pain. Wei Wei didn't waste any time. Seeing that Ling Tian had woken up, the girl handcuffed his hand to her arm. The girl reported accusing him of hooliganism and assaulting a police officer. Tian was arrested for disorderly conduct. Ling Tian almost cried. He couldn't go to the police station now, or else he would stop talking altogether later. Unfortunately, fate had decided otherwise. Wei Wei was sure of his guilt, so she left him at the station for questioning. At the police station, the girl asked one question after another so quickly that the young man did not have time to answer. Lin Tian was tired of all this, and he said in a tired voice that he had told many times before. He ended up there by accident. Wei Wei got angry and slapped her hand on the table. She shouted that she doesn't require too much. The young man only needs to tell the truth. Ling Tian recalled that he had already talked about it. There was a slight misunderstanding, and he was not a criminal at all. The young man begged and asked to be released, or he might go numb. Wei Wei laughed and said she could spend the whole day with him. Suddenly, a cell phone rang in the girl's breast pocket. Wei didn't take it out right away. She liked the tune. It turned out to be her immediate superior. He demanded that the young man be released from the interrogation room immediately. The door opened and Xiao Li entered the office. She reported that the young man had been bailed out. As a lawyer, she would answer any questions. Happy that he had some time, Ling Tian ran away and shouted that the girls would handle it without him. Unfortunately, Xiao Li arrived to the rescue too late. The car dealership was only open until 6 p.m. There were 2 hours left before the end of the mission. Lin Tian leisurely crossed the road on the crosswalk and pondered where he could now find a $2 million car. Suddenly, there was a long horn of a bus, which the young man had not noticed. The bus stopped at a crosswalk. The driver opened the door and shouted angrily that the young man was just sick of living. He had completely accidentally not hit him. Lin Tian didn't care about this at all. Time was inexorably moving forward, and he needed to find a way out. Suddenly, he thought of one. Lin Tian immediately smiled and thanked the bus driver fervently with a thumbs up. The young man ran on, humming a little song. The driver was puzzled. Strange behavior for a man who had almost been hit by a bus. Ling Tian was satisfied precisely because he ran into the bus. After all, there was a huge amount of horsepower in this monster. The interior has leather seats and automatic air conditioning with constant temperature. In addition, the bus mirrors have the ability to rotate 180 degrees for better visibility. After all, the system for the job just required buying a $2 million car, and the bus was quite suitable for that. Lin Tian smiled and patted the bus on the side. It seemed to the young man that such a vehicle was worth its money. Ling Tian was very satisfied with his acquisition. Now he knew that he would retain his ability to speak. Besides, having your own bus was already good because now you didn't have to worry about public transportation. The bus was purchased, and the self-satisfied young man saw a system notification that the first part of the assignment had been completed. The second part was more complicated. The purchased car had to win a race with controlled skids. Lin Tian's spirits immediately dropped. It was completely impossible for a bus to enter a controlled skid and win the race. Besides, there was a bigger problem. The young man had never experienced driving before, And this time, Manager Xiao Li came to the rescue. She said she could take over the bus. Ling Tian turned to the girl enthusiastically. She had saved his reputation again, and now the task could be completed. The young man fell on his knees and hugged the girl's legs. He exclaimed that he was very happy to see her and promised to give her a promotion. The girl frowned. She didn't like this. Xiao Li asked the young man not to take the opportunity to hug her. Ling Tian sighed regretfully and let go of the girl. He turned around and went up to the interior of his new bus. Now the young man's face looked very serious. He exclaimed that there was no time for chatter. He had to hurry to the race. A full moon rose over the neighborhood. The stars twinkled in the night blue sky. The race was scheduled for midnight. A mountain serpentine was chosen as the place for the upcoming competition. The view from here was magnificent. Several cars were already lined up at the starting area. One of the drivers declared that he would win today. Jiang Hao scornfully replied that his jalopy didn't even deserve the gases from his car's exhaust pipe. The young man was raised in laughter. Everyone knew that no one wanted to eat the food at the dinner, because Lin Tian had tricked him. Jiang Hao got angry and walked over to the person who was laughing at him. He grabbed his opponent by the collar of his jacket. Their argument was ended by a girl in a motorcycle suit who suddenly appeared, her face covered by a mask. She ordered everyone to shut up. The guy arguing with Hao enthusiastically exclaimed that it was the legendary racer Luo Jiashan. She drives a racing car. The girl was not going to listen to the arguers. She knew that her word alone was enough. Jiashan walked up to her snow-white car. The two doors of the car rose up smoothly, drawing the audience's attention to herself. Luo Jiashan frowned and suggested that everyone else start the race immediately. After all, everyone had already gathered. Jiang Hao remembered the legend of this girl. The one who defeated her in the race had the right to take off her mask and see her face. Leaning against his blue sports car, the young man loudly checked in with all the competitors to make sure they were ready. A sudden bright light blinded all the racers. It was just impossible to watch. Everyone turned away. Jiang Hao shrieked that he had gone blind and covered his eyes with his hands in panic. He really couldn't see for a while. Lin Tian lowered the side window of the bus and cheerfully said hello. He said that he would also take part in their race. A big city bus among fast sports cars looked more than strange. The racers were silent. Xiao Li sat as red as a cancer. She was very embarrassed. It was the first time she had ever come to a race by bus. Jiang Hao turned black with anger. Ling Tian had been catching his eye too often lately. Slowing down, the big yellow bus stopped beside the supercar the girl was sitting in. Lin Tian smiled. The girl in the white car was very pretty, and the young man leaned on the lowered window, gazing at her. Seeing that Ling Tian was watching her, Jiashan frowned. None of her rivals had any chance of winning the race today. Luo Jiashan was wearing a mask, and this intrigued the young man. He could easily recognize who was hiding behind it with his gift. Activating his X-ray vision, Ling Tian could see the adorable face of a girl without a mask. He recognized her. It turned out that Su Shuiqing, an honors student from their university, was hiding under the mask of a racer in a tracksuit. Su Shuiqing was not just an excellent student. This beautiful girl was idolized by all the students. Every other student was in love with her. Shuiqing was good at everything. She came from a rich family. The pretty girl also had a perfect figure. Moreover, for all her external virtues, Shuiqing had received a decent education and was an excellent student. In her spare time, the girl practiced big tennis. She proved to be capable and quickly earned the title of Master of Sports. Because of her famous, sweet, and gentle smile, the girl could not be mistaken for any other student. And the Shuiqing that Ling Tian knew from university was completely different from the race goddess Jiashan. Ling Tian stared at the beautiful girl without taking his eyes off her. He couldn't believe that the daring racer was the same excellent student. Jiashan was starting to get fed up with this. The girl frowned and asked why Lin Tian was staring at her. The young man immediately turned away and started looking forward through the windshield of the bus. He pretended to be thinking. Continuing to sneakily observe the girl, Ling Tian smirked. Shuiqing was acting too arrogant. Meanwhile, one of the organizers was already waving a checkered flag, announcing preparations for the start. The engines of the cars roared in anticipation of the countdown. As soon as the command sounded, the first racers raced forward. Since Lin Tian arrived later than everyone else, he had to start last. There was a red and blue car in front of him. In that high-speed sports car was Jiang Hao. He didn't understand how it even occurred to Tian to take the bus. Ling Tian himself looked carefree, as if he was confident of victory beforehand. While waiting for his turn, he leaned back in his chair. Before starting, Jiang Hao lowered his side window. Putting his thumb down, he shouted that he would stomp Lin Tian this time. All the participants were rapidly gaining speed. Only a white supercar and a yellow bus remained on the starting line. Ling Tian looked out the window and asked the girl why she was still standing still. It wouldn't take long for her to lose. It turned out that, according to the agreement with the referee, Jia gives all the contestants a 5-minute head start. Otherwise, it would be considered an offense. Ling Tian said that in that case, there was no hurry for him. He would wait for the girl to go and only then start moving. To Jia, this was very incomprehensible. She asked why he was willing to forfeit the entrance fee so easily. Lin Tian replied that the most important thing for him was to be patient and calm. It was only 500,000 yuan. In fact, the young man was ready to burst into tears. The system provided a huge amount of money that could not be spent elsewhere. Checking his wristwatch, the young man said that everything was still ahead of him, and it was too early to talk about money wasted. Lin Tian smiled and exclaimed that he would show all the racers some more, and then it would be seen who would lose and who would win. Jia didn't even allow for the thought that the young man could win. This bus was without various sports modifications. The young man smiled at the girl and exclaimed that he, the great Ling Tian, had a plan. He wasn't going to lose. Hearing a familiar name, Shuiqing immediately remembered that this guy had been talked about too much in the university lately. Meanwhile, the allotted 5 minutes of waiting had expired, and the girl resolutely moved the gear lever. Pressing the gas pedal to the floor, she smirked and said she'd really like to see the young man win the race. The speeding car was getting farther and farther away from the bus with each passing second. Shuiqing knew that she could beat everyone. Ling Tian realized that it was time for him to move out as well. He asked Xiao Li to act according to his plan. The first, most important step of the operation required a cell phone. The young man took it out of the bag. A minute later, a bell rang in one of the apartments in the metropolis. The caller's number was displayed on the screen of the landline phone. The girl was just finishing another pleasant dream, and that's why her sleepy voice sounded in the phone not at once. Ling Tian was satisfied that he had managed to get through to the girl. Now he could be absolutely sure that the plan would work. He took in more air in his chest and gathered his thoughts. He had to play the part as truthfully as possible. Just as all the competitors were approaching the mountain, Lin Tian informed Wei Wei about the crowd of riders on Luojiashan Mountain. Gaining speed, Jiang Hao neatly passed the dangerous corner at full speed with a controlled skid. As he pulled onto the straight road, the young man looked carefully in the rearview mirror. There was no one in sight. Jiang Hao rejoiced. This was as it should be. Lin Tian and his bus had stayed far behind and was unlikely to catch up with him. Remembering the insult he had received during dinner, Jiang promised himself that he would deal with it as soon as he won the race. Suddenly, the young man saw an obstacle in the road and had to apply emergency braking. Jiang Hao gripped the steering wheel, estimating the distance to the target. He wasn't sure if he could stop the car in time. There were spikes scattered all over the road, and the young man wailed exasperatedly that he would rip the head off whoever had set him up. Several policemen emerged from the bushes. 2 powerful flashlights blinded the young man's face. He realized there was no escape. Wei Wei exclaimed that there was no setup. She was arresting him for disorderly conduct and illegal gambling. The girl quickly tied Jiang Hao's hands with a strong rope and led him behind her. From the looks of it, there must be others. The sports cars drove off one after another. Wei promised herself that she would thank the citizen who had called the police. Lin Tian was calmly riding the bus at this time, knowing perfectly well that the riders were arrested and no one would interfere with him. Xiao Li asked if there was any other option to travel to the top of the mountain. Ling Tian laughed. He had thought of everything in advance. The young man said he called the police and blocked the shortcut. Now the others are forced to take a detour. Xiao Li fearfully assumed that they would have to storm the police post. The girl didn't want to go against the authorities. Ling Tian yawned lazily and stretched. He said that he didn't want to talk about it now. The girl would see everything later. The 5 riders stood shamefacedly at the edge of the overpass while Wei Wei reprimanded them and explained what they would face for disorderly conduct. Just as the officer decided to get closer to the offenders, a double bus came into view. He passed so close that the girl was blasted by a strong current of air. She grinned unhappily. Moreover, a fastener on the bus door caught her skirt and torn it in several places around her thigh. Wei Wei immediately blushed and tried to cover the torn place with her hands. She asked resentfully who did it. Lin Tian leaned out of the bus window as if nothing had happened and cheerfully said that his familiar Aunt Zhou was here. The officer indignantly suggested that Lin Tian was not here by chance and was also racing. The young man replied that no one in their right mind would race a bus, and she was just overworked. Lin Tian showed the route sign and said that he was taking the last bus home. He asked to clear the way. Wei Wei hesitated for a moment. She had to admit that the bus was not suitable for racing. The road spikes were removed from the road. Raising a cloud of dust, Ling Tian drove on. The officer looked after him. Suddenly, the girl realized her mistake. None of the buses reached Luojiashan Mountain. Holding up her skirt from behind, the officer squealed that she would deal with Lin Tian. Besides, he would pay her for the uniform. Xiao Li was quite pleased with the result. She reported that their bus was in the lead. In addition, half of the journey had been completed. No one was in their way now, and the bus, having bypassed the parked sports cars of the offenders, slowly accelerated. Jia Shan was traveling on a side road and was very surprised to see a big bus moving right behind her. The girl immediately realized that Lin Tian could only pull ahead if he called the police himself. There was no one in front of Jia Shan, and the girl was quickly widening the gap between the vehicles. Moreover, on a straight expressway, no sports car can catch up to it, let alone a city bus. Meanwhile, the bus was whistled over by a few more riders. Xiao Li worriedly said that now the situation had changed. Lin Tian had calculated everything in advance. He took out his phone and asked the caller to act according to the agreed plan. The young man put on dark glasses and asked to start right away. He added that he would allocate any amount of money for it. Jia Shan on her snow-white car was confidently leading in front and descending from the bridge. Jiang Hao was trying to catch up with her. The guy in the top 5 in the blue car was sure he could outrun the girl even in her sports car Snowstorm. The young man just recently installed modified nitrous acceleration in the car, and now no one can match it. Quickly flipping through the submenus of the onboard computer, the young man activated the nitrous acceleration and set it to maximum utilization. Nitrous oxide roared out of the exhaust pipes. The neon lights mounted in the rear bumper gave it a pink color. The blue sports car picked up speed so fast that it immediately caught up with Jia Shan and was now walking slightly ahead. Things were going pretty well, and the young man relaxed a little. Suddenly there was a bright, blinding light in the sky. The driver could not understand where such a bright source of light came from. It literally blinded the young man. It was simply impossible to go any further. It would be a big car crash. The young man pressed the brake pedal to the floor. The other participants of the race behaved in the same way. They stopped their sports cars wherever they could. Suddenly a loud voice came from the sky. He demanded that the Earthlings let him examine their bodies. The young man in the blue sports car knew right away. It was aliens, and they wanted to enslave the Earth. He didn't like that. Stepping out of the vehicle, the young man sobbed. He had lived too little on Earth and was not ready for an experiment with aliens. The light from the heavens flared brighter and brighter. The racers were not ready to leave this world and cried out in fear more and more. It seemed as if the beam from the alien ship was about to take them with it. The racers raised their hands in the air, begging not to be touched. At the moment when the speeding enthusiasts were kneeling with their hands up, a yellow bus slowly passed them. Lin Tian, wearing dark glasses, lowered his side window and smiled. He said that he was not an alien. Extending his hand out of the window, Lin Tian defiantly pointed them up into the sky directly at the blinding spot and declared that he was simply incalculably rich. Blindingly bright orbs shone on the road from all directions. The only way to hide from them was with dark glasses. Covering his eyes from the bright light, Lin Tian reported that he had done his part of the job. Now it was Xiao Li's turn. The girl frowned and took out a dart throwing tube. After loading the weapon, Xiao Li fired the dart tube. The man in the blue sports car began to suspect something, but it was too late. A sleeping pills dart was stuck in his neck. Not a few seconds later, the other drivers got their dose of sleeping pills too. The drug took effect instantly. They sank to the ground and fell asleep. 3 more opponents were eliminated. Lin Tian laughed and waved his hand. He asked the riders if they were familiar with the parable of the tortoise and the hare. He suggested that they get some sleep. Lin Tian placed a hand on the girl's shoulder in a friendly manner and informed her that she was doing great. While the young man once again checked the time, Xiao Li said with a smile that it couldn't have been otherwise. She had a worthy teacher. The racers were blissfully asleep on the ground. They were feeling good and pleasant. Xiao Li leisurely passed them and began to accelerate. The girl on Snowstorm finally managed to break through the obstacle and started to catch up with Lin Tian on the bus. Seeing 3 of his fellows lying in the middle of the road, Jia Shan was surprised. This Lin Tian was always coming up with something new. The glowing orb started to descend and blind the girl, but this kind of thing didn't work on her. Jia Shan put on her dark glasses just in time. Lin Tian was gradually getting rid of all the opponents, and it was time to clarify and speed up a bit. After pressing a red button on the control panel above the trunk, an aerodynamic spoiler extended from the rear. One after another, the exhaust pipes came out. Jia Shan activated the more efficient fuel mode. There was almost no time left. The girl pressed the pedal to the floor and simultaneously activated nitrogen acceleration. The bolide was hurtling down the road so fast that the tread rubber wiped out, and the rim shot sparks of flame along the way. This didn't bother Jia Shan in the slightest. She was only obsessed with one thought. Lin Tian could not be allowed to win. Lin Tian looked at the announcement of the upcoming broadcast and worriedly asked how long it was going to be. Xiao Li was just moving around the city center. After checking the map, she said that there were 3 kilometers left. Lin Tian sighed and said that it was very difficult to be the best. However, a worthy opponent was still nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, he heard a growing rumble from behind him. He couldn't understand what the strange sound was. Looking out the window, Lin Tian was surprised to see a bolide flying over the bus with a pink plume of smoke behind it. The young man had to admit that Jia Shan knew her business perfectly. She landed skillfully in front of the bus. The eyes of the rivals met. The girl's face was hidden behind dark glasses. She looked at the young man with interest. Ling Tian looked at his rival with displeasure. She shouldn't have caught up with his bus. Without taking her eyes off the young man, Jia Shan touched the collar of his jacket with her right hand. She recognized that Ling Tian was a worthy opponent. The young man was forced to note the girl's excellent driving skills. Only a goddess could catch up with him in such conditions. Jia Shan defiantly slowly overtook Xiao Li, increasing the distance between them with each passing second. Xiao Li confusedly asked her boss what they should do now. In a straight line, they would lose. Ling Tian scratched his chin. This was a turn of events he hadn't expected. It looked like he would have to accept defeat. However, there were still some considerations. The young man took out a walkie-talkie and asked if the girl could get the walkie-talkie into the car. Lin Tian might as well not ask. Xiao Li possessed various martial skills and techniques. Smiling, the girl began to tear the pants on her hip with her strong fingers. The fabric cracked and began to give way. With quick movements, Xiao Li tore the piece of cloth into long straps, exposing part of her thigh. The girl tied all the scraps into one belt and wrapped it around the walkie-talkie to be thrown over to Jia Shan. She leaned out of the window, switching places with the young man, and swung her device like a slingshot. Choosing a good moment, Xiao Li let go of the walkie-talkie and threw it towards the snow-white snowstorm bolide. Jia Shan was just looping along the road, trying to block the passage of the bus. At that moment, an object flew into her window. The girl was extremely surprised to notice that an intercom device had landed on the passenger seat beside her. A young man's voice immediately sounded on the radio. He suggested that the beauty stop and take a break. The journey was very hard. Jia Shan grabbed the walkie-talkie and advised him not to play games with her. In any case, he is a loser and can only lick her feet. Ling Tian laughed, and assured that he could only do so after beating her in this race. The girl got angry and declared that Lin Tian was just a dirty pervert, and he wouldn't be able to win today. The young man laughed and asked Jia Shan if she was sure she could beat him in the race. He contemptuously called her the queen of the race. Taking advantage of the girl's silence, Ling Tian said that it would be more accurate to call her Su Shuiqing. The girl turned pale. It was the first time someone had been able to find out her secret, and this despite the fact that she was always wearing a mask. Taking the opportunity, the young man looked at Su Shuiqing's black and red underwear. Naturally, she had no idea about it. Ling Tian lustfully thought that he could see not only the girl's face, but also her underwear. About this, he tactfully kept silent. The young man informed her that he had nothing against her secrets, but she could show some mercy and give in. Shuiqing realized what he was getting at and blushed. She shouted that this was too much and was crossing all boundaries. Nevertheless, the girl valued her secret more dearly and therefore stopped her car, letting the bus go forward. This was all the young man needed. At the finish line, the flag was already being waved, and Lin Tian raised a finger up. The young man regained great fame. In honor of his victory, champagne flowed in rivers, and the audience shouted enthusiastically. Shuiqing stood in the distance and glared angrily at the young man. She promised herself that she would kill Tian if he gave away the secret. The celebration was just beginning, and everyone was joyfully joining in the young man's victory. He had other plans, with only a little time left before the broadcast. Everything was done on time. A girl with pink hair wearing a white mask hiding her face started her broadcast. To warm up the audience, Sweet Faye decided to start the broadcast with a dance. She asked to keep her reward in mind. Faye in a purple dress put on some background music and started moving to it. The audience liked it and wanted to continue. Comfortable in the chair, Lin Tian just didn't know where to go from embarrassment. Faye's figure was very arousing to him. The girl moved very rhythmically. Ling Tian looked at her with great pleasure, trying to guess who was hiding under the mask. Without restraining himself, Ling Tian drooled. This girl under the mask must clearly be very pretty. Faye was spinning around in front of her webcam so much, trying to please her viewers, that even her ginger cat was watching with interest. Choosing a good moment, he jumped from the couch right onto the girl's back, thinking that his mistress was just playing with him. Faye noticed the danger too late, and didn't have time to dodge the insolent ginger cat flying straight at her. She fell to the floor out of surprise. The cat was frightened and ran away, not forgetting to scratch his mistress just in case. It was my left leg that took the brunt of it. It was just above my knee, and it was starting to ache terribly. The foot was much easier. The cat only lightly scratched his foot a little above the ankle, and it wasn't uncomfortable. After this incident, the viewers began to disperse. They were more interested in streamer Go Mimi, who undressed on live TV. Tian Fei was almost crying from annoyance. She sincerely apologized to her subscribers that she had made a big mistake. Ling Tian was shaking with anger. He almost idolized this girl and was very angry that she was being talked about so badly. Meanwhile, more and more people were leaving Tian Fei's broadcast. 26 viewers remained on the broadcast. Not a minute later, Fei was broadcasting live to 7 viewers. She also hit her head on the microphone stand. The last 4 viewers left on the air were watching a rabid cat play, which almost got elbowed in the face. Ling Tian almost cried from helplessness. If he had money, he would have made a classy donation and elevated Faye to the top list of streamers. Suddenly, the young man found something glowing brightly in his clenched fist. It was strange. There was nothing in it. Ling Tian unclenched his fist and realized that his own index finger was actually dazzlingly glowing. Meanwhile, on the screen, things had changed. Some generous stranger gave Tianfei Fei the achievement of broadcast queen. Ling Tian even envied that man who had so much money to give his goddess a prestigious title. Tianfei Fei herself was very surprised. Instead of a couple hundred subscribers, as many as 2 million people watched her. The girl almost cried with happiness. Stammering, she thanked Tian Tianlin for the gift and for the prestigious title. The young man was surprised. This was actually his alias under which he was subscribed to Tianfei Fei's broadcast. At this moment, a new notification from the broadcast to his personal account came to his phone. Tian was surprised and opened the news feed. It was an automatically generated letter. The young man was informed that he had obtained the status of a crown nobleman in the broadcasting room. Tian Tianlin was listed on the broadcast as the biggest donator, with an image of a crown placed in front of his nickname. Ling Tian couldn't believe that that multi-billionaire with good taste who had raised Fei to the top was himself. It was very strange because he didn't even have any money. He thought about it and remembered that he hadn't looked at his race award yet. Upon entering the system, Ling Tian was surprised. Apparently the reward was generated randomly every time. Today, he received the Golden Finger Award. With it, Ling Tian was able to spend any amount of virtual currency on any website. The next day, the young man went to the university. His thoughts were in the clouds. He didn't want to study at all. Ling Tian was a bit tired from yesterday's day and hadn't gotten enough sleep, so he lazily wandered down the corridor, yawning as he went. Suddenly, he saw a girl with a suspicious note and woke up immediately. He couldn't even believe such a coincidence. One of the school beauties was walking by in a dress, and her leg just above the knee was covered with a band-aid. Lin Tian immediately remembered his goddess Tianfei Fei's injury yesterday and suspected that this was it. He lifted his head higher, trying to figure out who the girl was and if it could be a similar injury. The girl was wearing a gorgeous white dress with short sleeves and green inserts on the hem and waistband of the dress. Noticing that she was being looked at, the beauty turned her head, smiling dazzlingly. It turned out to be Su Shuiqing. Lin Tan discreetly said hello to the girl and dejectedly lowered his head. He sighed heavily. Unfortunately, this was clearly not the broadcast queen. The girls did not resemble each other in height or face. Su Shuiqing, on the other hand, was overjoyed at the appearance of the guy. She embarrassedly exclaimed that she had been expecting him for quite some time. Ling Tian made a dismissive gesture and asked what the girl wanted from him. They still know very little about each other. Barely restraining herself from anger, Shuiqing discreetly asked the young man how he managed to pull all this off. Ling Tian didn't reply anything to the girl. He was attracted by a very bright light source coming from the corner of the classroom. The young man turned around and walked straight into the light, angrily questioning who the source of the glow was coming from. The blinding source of light was someone's head, which had been cut bald. The skin on the head glistened dazzlingly in the sunlight. As it turned out, it was Zhang Hao. After losing the race yesterday, he had lost his luxurious hair and was now sitting frowning. All this time, the young man was analyzing what had happened yesterday, and the fact that the police had arrested the racers was suspicious. And then Ling Tian showed up. Zhang had been bumping into him everywhere he went lately, and every time it ended badly. Suddenly, Zhang Hao realized everything and reproached himself for not guessing earlier. Only Ling Tian could call the police. He was in the tail. Zhang Hao jumped out from behind his desk and shouted at the young man, accusing him of being the one who called the police yesterday. Carelessly picking his nose, Ling Tian replied that he couldn't do that since he had been together with Su Shuiqing all last night. The eyes of all the classmates instantly focused on the girl, and she froze in place in surprise. Lin Tian's words could be understood in 2 ways, but technically, they were indeed together at night, overtaking each other on the track. The girl blushed like a boiled crawfish and nodded her head dejectedly. She was ashamed to look her classmates in the eye. In her heart, she was just furious and vowed to kill the arrogant man. No demon could match her in anger right now. Ling Tian made himself comfortable while humming a song. All the classmates looked at Shuiqing dumbfounded. The news had knocked them dead. Everyone was now discussing the shocking news that the heart of the unapproachable beauty had been broken, and she had a boyfriend. Su Shuiqing understood perfectly how they all interpreted Tian's words. However, her own secret was more precious. The bell rang and Miss Chen entered the classroom. She asked everyone to take their seats so that the class could begin. Since the teacher was short in stature, she had to stand on her toes, even in heels, to reach the top of the classroom blackboard. Miss Chen wrote down the topic on the blackboard. Turning to the class, she talked about the key concepts of today's topic. Ling Tian didn't listen to the teacher. It seemed to him that he was once again on the trail of his goddess Tian Fei. There were black hair marks on the left shoulder of Chen's snow-white shirt, and the young man thought they were cat marks. Below the thigh, the tights were torn exactly where Fei had been scratched by the cat yesterday, and this was the second coincidence. In addition, a little above her ankle, Miss Chen had characteristic small scratches like yesterday's broadcast. Ling Tian connected the thumb and index finger of both hands to each other, summoning the pattern recognition system. Miss Chen noticed that Ling Tian was acting rather suspiciously and turned towards him. To the young man's surprise, Miss Chen's face and height completely matched the image of Fei. Without her glasses, Miss Chen looked just like Fei. Miss Chen was indignant at such intense attention. She blushed a little and asked the young man what was going on. Ling Tian was almost crying with happiness. His unattainable goddess Fei had actually been by his side the entire time. And yet it seemed completely unbelievable that Teacher Chen was that sweet goddess Fei from the broadcast. As it turned out, the surprises didn't end there. Lin Tian received a notification to launch the system menu. He looked apprehensively at the screen. The system offered him a new task, now at the highest level of difficulty. This time, it required the top 3 streamers within a week. The reward was unknown. Lin Tian didn't understand the task itself. Looking intently at Miss Chen, the young man sighed and decided that he needed to complete the task first anyway. In addition, it was necessary to make sure that Miss Chen was Fei. X-ray vision should help with that. Ling Tian tried his best to convince himself that he wasn't doing this for pleasure. He needs to check the presence of the mole on Chen's thigh. Unfortunately, the young man never achieved the desired result. He only achieved a nosebleed caused by the sight of the girl. Miss Chen stood in front of the class and talked about a new topic, unaware that anyone could see her in the same red underwear and pantyhose. Ling Tian became angry. He never made sure that the girls were identical because the X-ray vision only removed one layer. Miss Chen noticed that Lin Tian was staring at her and asked the young man what he was looking at so intently. The young man immediately moved farther away and clapped his eyes in surprise, showing his disinterest with all his appearance. Miss Chen's phone rang at this moment. She was forced to put her suspicions aside. The teacher confusedly said that the group would do self-study today. She would check on them at the next class. Turning the other way, Miss Chen worriedly dialed the number of the person who had just called her. The information received was quite unexpected for the teacher. Despite her strict status, she ran out of the classroom. Ling Tian watched Miss Chen carefully, and the sudden tears in the girl's eyes did not escape his gaze. It was also similar to Fei's behavior. She cried the same way yesterday on the broadcast when she was insulted by the audience. Ling Tian couldn't take it anymore. Regardless of the outcome of his mission, the young man decided that no one had the right to offend his goddess. Miss Chen ran out of the university and got on a scooter in a hurry, remembering to put on her motorcycle helmet. When Ling Tian ran out of the building, it was already too late. Miss Chen had just pulled out of the parking lot, picking up speed. Lin Tian wasn't the only one watching her. A richly dressed young man wearing gold jewelry alerted someone about the girl's arrival. Ling Tian was already beside him. He resented this dandy trying to hit on his personal goddess. At this time, Miss Chen ran into the hospital. The case was very important and concerned the health of her relatives. The girl tearfully promised to find the money and asked if the doctor could help her father with the operation. The surgeon took off his glasses and explained that it wasn't about his desire. Their hospital had already allocated money for the last operation. Now there was nothing they could do. Miss Chen couldn't take it anymore and roared, covering her mouth with her hands to keep from screaming at the top of her voice. She realized that it was too bad. Meanwhile, a new notification arrived on the girl's phone. She was offered to have dinner with Mr. Zhou for $500,000. There was no way Miss Chen could agree to this unworthy proposal, but right now, she really needed the money. When the girl left the hospital, a decently dressed young man and his older partner, adorned with a solid gold chain, were already waiting for her. The man hinted to Miss Chen that it was time to deal with it, or her father might be in trouble. The young man laughed. He didn't expect Chen to be so stubborn when he signed the agreement with her. The young man took Chen's chin with 2 fingers and regretted that the girl was very beautiful. Chen immediately burst into tears. A lightning-fast blow to his right cheek made the young man lose his balance. Blood spattering, he began to fall on his side. The blow was so strong that the cocky young man flew back several meters. Chen continued to stand still. It wasn't until a second later that she realized what had happened and turned her head in surprise towards her savior. Ling Tian contemptuously told the young man that he and that man were nothing of value, and it was better for them to leave. He took Miss Chen's trembling hand and squeezed it tightly, demonstrating his ability to protect her. The young man angrily asked the men to listen to him and told them that it was his own girlfriend. Therefore, there was no need to hit on her. Miss Chen blushed thickly. This Ling Tian behaved very dignified in such a situation. Besides, he's also handsome. The man yelled that it didn't make any difference. This woman has a contract with their company and she owes them. According to him, Chen herself was at fault. She did not carefully read the terms of the agreement and now has to pay a fine. The man didn't have time to finish his sentence. Without trying very hard, Ling Tian slapped his cheek with the palm of his hand resoundingly. The man fell silent. Lin Tian explained that sometimes it was better to remain silent if you didn't know how to compromise with your interlocutor. The young man in the colored shirt started to get up from the ground. The blow was very strong, and his whole body trembled from the strain. Worst of all, he had lost 2 of his front teeth in the little skirmish. The stranger could not be forgiven for that. He roared that the young man should be killed for the insult. He rushed towards Ling Tian while revealing a folding knife. The man had the same knife in his hands. He was going to come at Tian from the other side and punish him properly. Lin Tian assessed the extent of the threat. A red-haired insulted youth with a knife walked in from one side. As he got closer, the man stated that his fist was no stronger than the steel blade of a knife anyway. Lin Tian laughed and stated that they had misunderstood everything. He motioned for the men to turn back and look carefully. The 2 young men immediately turned back, assuming that Lin Tian was hinting at the ambush he had set up. To their surprise, there was no ambush behind them. There was a house in the distance, not even a passerby in sight. At the same time, Lin Tian took advantage of the confusion and rushed past them with Miss Chen in his arms. Cries could be heard from behind. Fortunately, there was a yellow bus at the stop, and the young man rushed to it without letting the girl out of his strong arms. Ling Tian was in such a hurry to get on the bus so quickly that he jumped a few steps in one fell swoop and found himself in the cabin. Without hiding their intentions, the pursuers entered the bus holding knives in their hands. The red-haired man demanded to catch the guy immediately. Despite all of this, Ling Tian calmly sat still, holding the girl trembling in his arms, humming a song under his breath. Lin Tian cheerfully said that these guys didn't even realize whose bus they had climbed into. The redhead shouted that they'd had enough once. They couldn't be fooled a second time. He can't own a bus. The young men were mistaken. Xiao Li was rushing towards them at full speed. She was already itching to count their ribs. The young man in the colored shirt was standing closer to the girl, and therefore immediately received a knee to the nose. Straightening her leg, Xiao Li tried to hit the second man, but he stepped back in time, a little surprised by the appearance of the Amazon's 6th woman. Leaping forward, Xiao Li stamped the forged heel of her boot into the groin area. The man cried out in great pain. Taking the uninvited guests by the collars, the girl simply threw them out of the bus. They fell on top of each other unconscious. Back in the cabin of the bus, the girl sat behind the wheel as if nothing had happened and began crunching her fingers. Lin Tian opened the window and shouted to the men that this bus belonged to him. He commanded Xiao Li to start moving. The bus drove off, blowing a cloud of smoke at the bouncers. The men were now out of it, out of their minds. Miss Chen blushed thickly. Closing her eyes, she softly called the young man's name. The girl was very grateful to him. The teacher was acting rather strange, and Ling Tian asked Miss Chen what else was bothering her. The girl asked to let her go, for Lin Tian had completely forgotten about it and was still hugging her. The young man pretended to think hard. He laughed and immediately let the shy teacher go. Ling Tian smirked and said that he had actually forgotten about holding her. He winked slyly to himself. Miss Chen confusedly said that it was still better for the young man to stop the bus and let her off. She was very worried about her father. The girl excitedly said she couldn't pay under the terms of the contract, so she would just apologize to them. Lin Tian said that he couldn't let her out. There's nothing to worry about. Miss Chen is now his person. The system counted a third of the task. Lin Tian realized that it was possible to collect streamers individually. It made the task easier. Chen turned green with anger. She shouted that there was no need to talk nonsense and pulled the young man's ear. Chen asked when she had time to become Tian's human. Ling Tian fell right onto her chest and they both blushed. The young man said that she would soon become his man. Miss Chen blushed like a boiled crawfish. She reminded the young man that she was his teacher. Ling Tian laughed and announced that the bus had arrived at the teacher's stop. Xiao Li stopped the bus. The doors opened in front of the dumbfounded teacher. Lin Tian smiled and said goodbye to the girl. The bus left, but Chen continued to stare after him. She realized that the young man really liked her. Their feelings were mutual. Unfortunately, Chen had to admit that their position as teacher and student did not lend itself to a relationship. Meanwhile, the yellow bus drove further and further away from the city center. After half an hour, Xiao Li arrived at an abandoned factory. There were rusty barrels and scattered construction materials everywhere. It was obvious that no one had been interested in this place for a long time. Xiao Li stopped the bus. Ling Tian frowned, wondering if they had reached the proper place. Xiao Li confirmed that they had arrived at the same place. She worriedly asked if more people needed to be summoned. Ling Tian smirked. He didn't need anyone. The young man asked Xiao Li if she had prepared everything for the task. The girl snapped the locks on the long case and assured her boss that she had prepared everything he asked for. Lin Tian came out of the bus with a case and told Xiao Li that there was no need to be afraid of anyone. They had a powerful gun. Several thugs stood dejectedly at the entrance. It was not a dusty job, and no one was trying to threaten them here. One of them glumly suggested that the kid was just lost or looking for trouble. The other man stared at the guest. Ling Tian didn't say a word. He hefted the case onto his shoulder and stopped at the threshold to the abandoned room. There was someone sitting in a luxurious armchair against the wall with his back to the door, smoking a cigar. The smoke could be heard even outside. Ling Tian waited at the entrance for a while. The sun cast his long shadow almost all the way to the boss's desk. Ling Tian shouted that there was no need to pretend to be a very important person. He must get everything done and make it to the broadcast on time. A man in a snow-white suit with a cigar in his teeth turned around unhappily and suggested that the young man was involved in Fei Fei's kidnapping. The man was very angry. Kidnapping was already a crime in itself, and he wanted to put pressure on the young man. Ling Tian didn't even think of denying that he was involved. He admitted his guilt and asked what the boss expected to do next. The man didn't seem to hear his reply. He shouted that the young man refused to admit his guilt in kidnapping the beauty. Ling Tian looked at the man in surprise. The boss didn't expect the young man to confess at all and didn't know what to do next. Ling Tian was satisfied that he had managed to confuse the man. He smirked contemptuously and reached into his sinus. The thugs immediately rushed into the room. Two of them covered their boss, while the third ordered the young man to stay where he was. To the surprise of everyone present, it wasn't a gun at all. Ling Tian raised his hand with a key that ended with a pig's head. The boss and his bodyguards looked at the young man in bewilderment. It all seemed like some kind of silly prank. Taking the pig by the head, Lin Tian snapped off all the locks on the long green case. The bodyguards watched him cautiously. The young man began to open the lid of the case. There was a red oblong object in the white velvet. The bodyguard squealed that it was really bad, and this time the kid actually pulled a gun out of the case. One of the guards was immediately punched in the face. The big man didn't expect it and slowly fell to the ground. Xiao Li rushed into the room like a hurricane. The bodyguards flew off in different directions from her blows. Now no one could prevent the young man from realizing his plan, and he ran straight to the scared-to-death boss. Lin Tian suggested that the man bargain for Tian Fei Fei since he valued that girl so much. The young man pointed his gun at his boss and coldly looked at the man, who had turned white with fear, through the telescopic sight. The man shrank into a ball. He didn't want to die so early at all. Ling Tian moved the trigger slightly. Lin Tian ran up to the organization boss and put his foot on the table. He shouted that the man should take his shot. Unfortunately, there was nothing the bodyguards could do to help the boss. They themselves had only recently gotten up from the floor and watched the chief shaking with fear. His whole life flashed before the man's face in a few seconds. He was in tears, cursing the boy's recklessness. Ling Tian pulled the trigger. When the gun fired, the young man mockingly mimicked the sound of the trigger clanking. Closing his eyes, the boss was preparing himself to die every second. He even covered his glasses with his hand so he wouldn't see that fatal bullet. To his surprise, time passed, but nothing happened. The man dared to open his eyes after a few seconds. Everything around him was strewn with money. It kept falling from the sky. The man realized that there was enough money for everyone in paradise. In fact, Ling Tian had no intention of killing him. The gun in his hand spewed out bills at the speed of an ATM machine. By pointing the gun upward, the young man achieved the effect of a real rain of money. The banknotes continued to fill the room. Ling Tian roughly ripped the man away and said that he alone was a god here, and every bullet was a payment for the contract with Tian Fei Fei. The young man showed the girl's photo to his boss and said that from that moment on, the girl no longer belonged to his company. The man tried to protest. He perfectly understood Fei Fei's value and her creativity. Ling Tian threw away the unloaded gun. He looked angrily at the man and said that he did not accept any objections. Lin Tian understood the man's doubts in his own way. He went to the case, saying that money was not a problem for him. The young man laid 2 more full clips of banknotes on the table in case a loaded gun wasn't enough. A downpour of money flew into the man's face. He barely had time to fight off the money, but the bills kept flying. Throwing away the empty pistols, Ling Tian wondered if this amount was enough or still not enough. This time he came with 3 guns at once. The young man held the 3rd gun in his teeth. Tian promised a triple money storm. The bodyguards were willing to forgive everything to Lin Tian. They were literally swimming in money. Greed clouded the gang boss's eyes, and he immediately extended the contract to own Tian Fei Fei to the young man. Leaving the room, Ling Tian waved the contract and said that Tian Fei Fei was his girlfriend. This should not be forgotten. When Ling Tian returned to the bus with the contract, Xiao Li politely inquired if it was worth spending so much money on her teacher. Tearing the contract into small pieces, the young man noted that Fei Fei was definitely worth that much money, but it would be wrong to give money to someone who bullied his favorite teacher, Miss Chen. At this time, there was complete confusion in the gang's den. The boss still didn't understand what had happened to his pile of money. Only one thing was clear. He was very much deceived, and instead of real bank bills, the whole room was full of forgeries. One of the thugs exclaimed that he had managed to find 3 real bills. He was holding 250 yuan in his hand. Another bodyguard managed to find exactly the same amount. He happily ran up to the chief with 3 banknotes. The man slammed the bodyguard into the wall and shouted angrily that he had no interest in such trash. Suddenly, the muzzle of a gun was pointed at the back of his head. A voice warned the boss not to move. The gun was real. The voice was quite familiar. The man furtively turned his head slightly and immediately recognized the girl threatening him. Without delay, he fell at Chaozong's feet and began to sprawl in apology, almost kissing her brown shoes. The girl watched coldly as the man drenched himself in tears and stepped a toe on her boss's head. Laughing, the girl in the white dress said the man was better off just dying and pointed a gun at him. The next day, everything went on as usual. Miss Chen was sitting in the teacher's office. A courier knocked on the door and delivered a package. The girl was very surprised. She hadn't ordered anything in her name lately. Barely opening the box, Chen began to guess what was what. The pieces of torn paper were very familiar. Chen couldn't believe her eyes. She was afraid to even think about what was inside that box. It was simply unbelievable. Coming to her senses, Chen concluded that her contract with that company was invalid since it was lying around like that. Moreover, there was one whole sheet of paper lying among the scraps of paper. It looked like a message. Chen took it in her hands with interest. It turned out to be a new contract. A certain talent agency on behalf of Tian Tianlin was interested in her. That name seemed familiar. Chen remembered that she had been given the status of broadcast queen on the air a few days ago. The girl was so engrossed in studying the contract that she didn't notice her being watched through binoculars. Hiding among the foliage, Xiao Li watched Chen intently. She recorded her teacher's every gesture. Ling Tian at this time made himself comfortable under a tree. He knew that he could relax. With Xiao Li by his side, not even a mouse would slip through. Yawning, the young man opened his eyes and asked the girl if Miss Chen had signed his contract. Xiao Li carefully jumped onto the lower branch of the tree. A second later, she had already landed neatly beside the young man. Xiao Li said that the girl couldn't refuse such a generous offer. Her father really needs the money for the operation. Because of Fei Fei's newly obtained status, Fei Fei has attracted a lot of attention. The popularity of her broadcasts has increased. Unfortunately, Lin Tian could only buy 2 people with money, and something must be worked out with the 3rd streamer. First, we had to find out who other girls are in the top in terms of views of their broadcasts and subscribers. Typing in a query about streaming services, Lin Tian found a girl with the pseudonym Chao Biluo at the first place. Smiling to himself, Tian thought that she was exactly what he needed. He was determined to get the most popular streamer by all means. Below was a girl with pink hair. She seemed like a child, but she had an audience of up to 15 million. To Lin Tian, the information he received was quite enough. Such a popular girl was clearly worth her money. A young man entered the bus with a nameplate and told Xiao Li that they were going to negotiate with the girl. He would offer any contract. The pretty girl at the cafe table smiled embarrassedly and agreed to sign the contract. Ling Tian was surprised that the girl didn't even bargain. After all, she is in first place among streamers. Continuing to smile, Biluo hugged the young man's arm and admitted that she saw him as a good person. She was sure that Lin Tian wouldn't lie to her. Ling Tian was pleased to hear such words. He blushed and exclaimed that this little girl had a great future ahead of her. Ling Tian did not hide his joy. He only had to get one girl to complete the task. The young man didn't even realize that Biluo had agreed for a reason. She had her own ulterior motives. In her heart, she was smiling gloatingly. The terms offered to the girl were quite acceptable. She poured red wine into glasses and offered to drink to the young man. Ling Tian stopped controlling himself. He grabbed the offered glass and agreed to drink with the girl. He was ready to drink until he lost his senses. Having caught his vigilance, Biluo faintly nodded to the waiter standing behind her back. He immediately realized that it was time to act. Frowning, the man held his gaze on the young man for a few seconds, studying him, and then walked out of the cafe. Xiao Li was outside and spotted a strange man who was about to board her boss's yellow bus. Once inside the cabin, the man looked around and unzipped his jacket. He reached into the inside pocket for one thing. Suddenly, a dart with a dose of sleeping pills slammed into the man's neck. He was too busy and did not notice the danger from outside. Xiao Li was in the cabin in a flash and declared that no one could be on the bus without fighting her. With a grunt, the man pulled the dart from his neck and stood up, rubbing the bruised spot. Li couldn't believe it. The girl shouted that this could not be. She wondered why the man had not been affected by the sleeping pills. The man dismissively replied that he was immune to sleeping pills and she just didn't realize who she was dealing with. The man stripped down to his waist and turned towards her. Xiao Li only now realized that this old man belonged to the Maori. The man grinned gloatingly and promised to show the girl his unique martial arts skills. Xiao Li was not intimidated by this. She only frowned and adopted a fighting stance. The girl had to fight with different opponents. Xiao Li swiftly threw her fist at the man's face. He deflected backwards in surprise. The girl noted that the old man had an unusually flexible body. She asked what his movements were called. The man replied that it was no movement at all, and intercepted the girl's hand with a swung fist by the wrist. The old man turned the girl around and threw her to the floor. He exclaimed that this complex was called a square dance. Xiao Li was instantly on her feet, rubbing the bruised spot on her head. It was quite painful. The girl was angry. It was a rather insidious technique. She decided to defeat her opponent at any cost. Xiao Li rushed at her opponent and began to deliver lightning-fast strikes, changing their trajectory at the last moment. Old man Wu Dalan had no trouble dodging every punch. He informed the girl that she would not be able to keep up with his rhythm. Catching a good moment, the man counterattacked and gave the girl a powerful slap. She was very shocked. The battle was clearly unequal. The old man sat the girl on a seat on the bus and took selfies with her, making a satisfied smile. Meanwhile, in the cafe, Lin Tian and Biluo were enjoying the exquisite food. Over a glass of wine, the young man didn't care about Xiao Li. Losing his vigilance, the flushed Lin Tian was already dozing at the table after a while, intoxicated with alcohol. Biluo smiled smugly. She had succeeded. Ling Tian was not thinking of anything at all right now. Underneath the girl's skirt was a hidden powder. She still couldn't figure out if Lin Tian was drunk enough. Ling Tian snorted heavily on the table without letting go of his glass. The remnants of red wine slowly flowed out. Biluo put her foot on the table and disdainfully asked the young man how he could believe that she would actually sign the contract. Taking a sip of wine, the girl said she would break the contract and then throw the young man himself on the bus, where the evidence was already waiting for him. Biluo laughed out loud and declared that it wouldn't be long before he was in jail drinking with his cellmates. Suddenly, Lin Tian said in a completely sober voice that he had completely forgotten. He didn't like drinking. The girl immediately stopped laughing. To her surprise, Lin Tian no longer looked like a hungover guy and sat calmly at the table, watching the girl's reaction. Biluo was no longer hiding her true intentions. She stammered and tried to ask the young man how he did it. As embarrassing as it was to think about it, the first thing Lin Tian did was to look at the girl with his X-ray vision. The young man told Biluo that she should have hidden that powder better. He noticed it as soon as he sat down at the table. Thinking back to that moment, Ling Tian smiled. This was how one could get used to looking at all girls with magic optics. Biluo indignantly shouted that it still didn't mean anything, and sooner or later, Tian would still end up in her hands. The young man smiled and got up from the table. He reported that Biluo should have worried about himself first. After introducing himself with a gold chain and an expensive cigar, Lin Tian said that the girl might be interested in who drank her powder. Barely glancing at her empty glass, the girl sat back in her seat fearfully. She realized what the boy was implying. Biluo cried out in frustration. The girl realized that Lin Tian had outplayed her. She screamed that it was just disgusting. After a moment, she felt that she could no longer control herself. As she fell asleep, Biluo declared that Lin Tian was a bad person. Ling Tian bent over the table and informed the girl that there were still things to do. He blushed and smiled. Lustfully licking his lips, the young man chuckled gloatingly. Biluo was now completely in his power and couldn't stop him. A confused Biluo opened one eye and squealed that Lin Tian couldn't do that. It was simply illegal. Ling Tian smiled and asked what she saw as a violation of the law. The young man reported that he had not done anything illegal. From his sinus, Ling Tian pulled out the most ordinary cellophane bag and looked at the girl questioningly. The young man began carefully transferring the food from the plates to the bag and indignantly said he saw nothing illegal in it. Biluo turned purple with anger. Lin Tian paid no attention to her and went about his business. The young man stated that she had the wrong concept of dinner. In addition, he had eaten almost nothing and was still hungry. Biluo indignantly shouted that there was a stunning beauty sitting in front of Lin Tian, and he was worrying about leftovers. Ling Tian scratched the back of his head and wondered what was wrong. He couldn't imagine the girl putting herself before food. Biluo couldn't stand it. She shouted that she was furious at this behavior and kicked the table as hard as she could. The table staggered, and the tablecloth with the remaining dishes went on the girl. One plate was close to the edge of the table. After the next blow, the plate containing the custard tarts flew rapidly downward. The plate shattered into many shards. Some of them were mixed in with the attractive-looking cakes. Ling Tian shook with anger. These were his favorite cakes, and the girl had purposely ruined the products. Lin Tian ran up to Biluo and grabbed her wrist. The young man forced the surprised girl up with a strong jerk. Ling Tian made himself comfortable in the chair and positioned the girl on his lap, about to spank her. Biluo immediately realized what Lin Tian was going to do and tried to break free. The young man brought his hand in, holding the girl securely. At the same second, the first slap reached its target. The girl flinched at the insult. Biluo burst into tears and wailed through her tears that Lin Tian was just a disgusting person, and he would not get away with it. Lin Tian continued to spank her. Each spanking was accompanied by the accusation that the girl was spoiling food and breaking dishes. Biluo was in a lot of pain. She screamed that even her father didn't beat her. Lin Tian is a very bad person. Ling Tian rejoiced and exclaimed that he could take care of the girl's upbringing himself. He spanked her with redoubled vigor. After a while, the young man decided that Biluo had had enough for today. He hummed a song and went to the exit of the cafe. The offended girl ducked into a corner and roared. Her whole body shook from crying. No one had ever humiliated her so badly before. In the doorway of the cafe, Lin Tian bumped into Wu Dalan. The man was about to see a different picture. The young man must be out. The old man gave Lin Tian a puzzled look. However, it didn't matter so much. His plan would still work. Wu Dalan ran up to the girl who was sitting on her knees resentfully. He asked Mrs. Cow what had happened here. The girl embarrassedly replied that she was perfectly all right, and hurriedly asked her interlocutor how it had gone. The man nodded affirmatively. He reported that everything was ready. Lin Tian's fate was about to change for the worse. Xiao Li rode with a frown. The young man was tipsy. It turned out that he hadn't paid attention to the fact that Xiao Li was very pretty before. Suddenly there was the rising sound of a police siren from behind. One of the crews was rapidly catching up with them. 3 police cars blocked their way and Xiao Li was forced to stop her bus. It turned out that based on a report from a concerned citizen, the police suspect that Lin Tian is hiding stolen money. The young man opened the door of the bus and went down 1 step. It was the first time he had heard about the stolen money. Xiao Li meanwhile pulled Lin Tian's sleeve hard. Unsuspecting, the young man did not resist the girl. Xiao Li placed some object in her boss's hand and faintly smiled. Tian decided to see what it was. It turned out that Xiao Li had handed the young man a real gun. He couldn't understand why the girl did it. The policeman rejoiced. This Ling Tian pulled out his gun at the worst possible time. It was only to their advantage. The man angrily squealed that the suspect had pulled a gun and called all the arriving officers for help. He ordered to shoot to kill. Meanwhile, Ling Tian himself was surprised to think that he had never held a gun before. Seeing the gun barrels aimed at him, Lin Tian turned pale. He was in a hopeless situation. The policeman laughed smugly and ordered him to open fire. Everything was under his control. One of the police officers lowered her weapon, and this infuriated the officer. No one has the right to disobey an order. Zhou Weiwei ran into the bus and covered the criminal suspect with her body. Tian was surprised. This was unexpected. Weiwei asked Officer Yuan to take a closer look at the suspect's weapon. It's actually a water pistol. Such a thought never even crossed the young man's mind. He raised the gun up and pulled the trigger. A fountain of water spurted out. The officer became furious. Things didn't go according to plan. Yuan shouted that Lin Tian was dangerous. He was resisting arrest. Weiwei stated that the young man would not be able to escape. They had blocked all the roads, so there was no reason to shoot him. Yuan recalled that Zhou Weiwei is investigating this guy herself, and it is very strange that she is helping him. The girl replied that she was being fair. They shouldn't catch the good guys and leave the bad guys free. Ling Tian hugged the girl tightly and called her Sister Zhou. He was pleased to be called a good guy. Weiwei shouted in embarrassment that there was no need to touch her. He is still a suspect. It was just not necessary to shoot him. Officer Yuan ran up to the girl. Grabbing her shoulders, he pushed Weiwei away from the bus in front of everyone. Seeing that Zhou Weiwei had fallen, Lin Tian became enraged. He began to suspect that Officer Yuan was playing a double game. The young man angrily exclaimed that this was too much and was a case of abuse of authority. Yuan smiled and declared that he was now screwed. Other than Zhou Weiwei, no one would stand up for him. Ling Tian smiled contemptuously and said that Officer Yuan was letting himself talk too much extra. He approached the dark nook and loudly demanded to get out immediately. Yuan peered into the darkness with interest. There was a strange sound in the silence. Something was coming closer and closer from the darkness, and the sound grew louder. It turned out to be a small quadrocopter. It was within range of the police and recorded everything on camera. Officer Yuan became enraged. This evidence was completely useless and could ruin his successful career. He managed to grab the drone and began to slowly clench it in his fist. The quadrocopter sparked. The machine began to malfunction. Officer Yuan threw the spy device he hated onto the ground with all his might and smashed it into small pieces. The debris went flying in all directions. There was no question that the evidence could have remained intact. Yuan shouted that Lin Tian definitely had nothing now. He was so engrossed that he almost lost his red wig. Lin Tian calmly stated that streamers Cao Biluo and Tian Fei were working for him, and the policeman should draw conclusions. An angry Yuan snatched a gun from one of his men and declared that there was nothing special about money. It is important to be alive to spend it. Lin Tian dejectedly held his head and said that Yuan was really dumb. After all, everyone knows about live broadcasts. Yuan became enraged and pointed a gun at him. He exclaimed that money doesn't solve everything. Some girl touched the gun and said that this gun is very realistic and looks like the real thing. A crowd of people ran out of the bus. They had all come to see Fei Fei. The girl promised that she would come here. One of the women admired Officer Yuan's police uniform. She said their footage looked realistic. Lin Tian smiled and winked at the officer. He said that in fact money really does solve any issue. The effects of the narcotic powder had finally worn off. Chao Bi Luo felt a little better already. The girl asked the old man where Lin Tian was now. She wanted to take revenge for the young man laughing at her. Wu Dalan solemnly assured that he always performs his task completely. There is no problem with him. The girl angrily said that she was about to call whoever she wanted to call, and then Lin Tian would really regret contacting her. Suddenly, all the girl's excitement was replaced by a perplexed look on her face. There was definitely something wrong with her phone. It turned out that instead of her latest model cell phone, Lin Tian had slipped her a baby pink phone. The girl's angry cries that her phone had been tampered with could be heard far beyond her pink villa. In order to organize a successful broadcast, Lin Tian lowered the glass of the bus and leaned the 3 phones against it. One of the phones belonged to Chao Bi Luo, the other was put up by Chen Fei Fei. She also launched her broadcast. More and more people came to the bus. Everyone wanted to watch the broadcast live. Lin Tian was glad that he was able to do so. That meant he could sign a new contract with that sly girl from the cafe. The young man smiled and took out a contract with a pen. In calligraphy, he wrote his name on the contract. There was nothing Chao Bi Luo could do now. The system reported that the task had been updated. Lin Tian would be satisfied. There was only one streamer left to gain support. Smiling for the camera, he enthusiastically asked the audience if they enjoyed the live open-air broadcast. He asked all subscribers to remember him. He is now live on Chao Bi Luo, and tomorrow he will be the richest in the world. By chance, yesterday's subscriber Tian Tian Lin became a famous streamer. His broadcast was watched by 1.5 million viewers. Reading the comments of subscribers, the young man cheerfully said to himself that all this is very good, but the audience is still not enough. Suddenly there was the sound of a gunshot. As it was quite noisy, many people just didn't pay attention to it. Those who were standing closer to the shooter started yelling and spreading panic that someone was shooting right during the broadcast. An angry Yuan sneaks up on the young man and says he won't shoot him. Nevertheless, he is forced to search his bus. Lin Tian rejoiced. Right now, any action against him was only playing into his hands. He tried to block the entrance to the bus and fearfully asked not to search the bus. There were a lot of people watching the broadcast right now. Yuan figured that the guy could get into serious trouble, worth it just to say a bad word about Her Highness. The officer angrily reached out and pulled out the closest phone to him. It was impossible to leave Lin Tian with any evidence. Yuan threw the cell phone on the ground and ordered police officers to enter the bus and search everything thoroughly. At the same second, shod heels clattered amicably on the foot of the bus, as if the police were purposely hiding nearby. Lin Tian walked over to Officer Yuan and politely thanked him, delicately placing a hand on the man's shoulder. The officer could not understand what caused this fellow's change of mood, for he himself had just begged not to be searched. Yuan smirked and assumed that Lin Tian had something to say for himself. Be that as it may, it was already too late. The young man explained that Yuan smashed the phone from which the broadcast was being broadcast. This would only spur people's interest in what was happening. He exclaimed joyfully that everyone here was part of his broadcast. From all sides, dozens of people were filming the events on their phone cameras. Yuan began to lose his temper. He shouted that it didn't matter. The young man would soon be caught and put behind bars anyway. One of the police officers leaned out the window and said they were able to find a suitcase that looked similar to the missing one. Officer Yuan rejoiced. This was the moment of his triumph and the capture of the criminal. He smiled and demanded to open the suitcase. The officer gloated. He knew that no one could escape circumstances where his men planted important evidence. The policeman obediently opened the case. The whole interior of the bus was flooded with blinding light, and I wanted to close my eyes. The policemen stared in amazement at the contents of the suitcase. They had never seen anything like this before in their lives. Officer Yuan was even more surprised. According to his plan, the police officers should have discovered the suitcase with the stolen money. Seeing the subordinates opening the suitcase, Yuan smiled and exclaimed that the evidence was undeniable. There was nowhere to go. Lin Tian theatrically adopted a pose and said that he was very remorseful for what he had done. He shouldn't have loved learning so much. Officer Yuan did not understand what the young man meant. He asked what kind of study he was talking about, and what study had to do with it. It turned out that the suitcase was full of textbooks for the secondary school course. On top were math and English textbooks. When Yuan saw the contents of the suitcase, he was simply speechless. The policeman didn't know what to say either. It was too late to retreat, and the officer wailed angrily, wondering what this was all about and where Ding Tian had hidden the stolen money. The young man scratched the back of his head and nonchalantly asked what stolen money we were talking about. He didn't understand what was going on at all. The officer yelled that the young man had hidden the looted money on the bus. The police officer found the suitcase it was in. Ling Tian smiled and assumed that they were actually trying to plant a suitcase of money on his bus. The officer became angry and drew his gun. He shouted angrily that slandering the police was equivalent to a crime. Ling Tian put his hand on the weapon and frowned. Yuan had better put the gun down or he wouldn't get off with just one jail sentence. The officer turned pale and pulled his gun. He squealed, asking again who would help the young man in such a situation. Ling Tian smiled widely and said that not long ago, no one could. But now this person had appeared in his own right. Officer Yuan started to turn around unhappily, spewing curses, and suddenly faltered. Behind his back stood a tall man. Behind the man in the suit was a squad of heavily armed Special Forces fighters. The man told Yuan that he wondered if he could stop him. Officer Yuan turned pale. He immediately recognized Director Zhou from the Disciplinary Bureau. His appearance did not bode well. Yuan fell to his knees. Zhou said that he had received an internal report with evidence of various disciplinary violations. He will not tolerate criminality, so he will continue to investigate and convict Yuan according to the law. Yuan was led away by the escorts. He shouted that he didn't really know where the money had gone. It had just been in the suitcase. Looking at a satisfied Ling Tian, Director Zhou asked his daughter if he had anything to do with her appearance in the district attorney's office. Zhou Wei faintly smiled and bashfully informed that she had come just because of him. Yuan fretted at him inexplicably. Zhou stated that her boyfriend has a heart of gold. Besides, he is quite smart and does his job in cold blood. Wei immediately blushed red. She indignantly shouted that Lin Tian was not her boyfriend at all. He was a suspect. Director Zhou said that it's all unimportant. He should go and continue his investigation, and Wei should be more careful. Zhou withdrew. Wei said to herself with embarrassment that she knew all of this herself, and he let himself talk a lot. Lin Tian was satisfied that he understood the system's ability to make money disappear and appear. They would be useful for promoting streamers. This time the top streamers have changed. Streamer with the nickname Tian Lin managed to win the 3rd place in the ranking. Ling Tian smiled. He had walked to this for quite a long time and had gone through some trouble, but he was able to complete the task. The system was going to give out a reward, and Tian hoped he'd get a full-body X-ray. Unfortunately, this time the system's reward was access to the main quest branch and a small vault. Nevertheless, it could be interesting, and Lin Tian decided to check out what the main task was. Business district of the city. In one of the skyscrapers of the metropolis, a young man was in one of the offices located in a penthouse. He was standing at a window in a business suit on the upper floors, talking on the phone. Suddenly, he had a sense of danger. This interested the young man. He was always ready for new challenges and accomplishments. The terms of the new assignment required him to create a new company. Ling Tian thought that there were no strict requirements this time. It could be considered that he already had a company. There were 2 contracts in hand with Qian Feifei and Cao Biluo. Lin Tian laughed loudly and said that things would soon change. He would soon become the richest man in the world. The man couldn't stand it and forcefully put the bottle of sunflower oil he had chosen in front of the seller's nose. Director Zhou was tired of waiting. He asked the salesman to finally sell him the item he had chosen. Ling Tian seemed as if he had only now realized that he was at work, and looked puzzledly at the sunflower oil man. He smiled politely and apologized. The young man said he was distracted and didn't notice the man at the counter. Lin Tian almost cried. With unlimited money in the system, he must work part-time in real life. The girl in the white and red sneakers didn't see the cellophane bag on the floor. When she stepped on it, she slipped and fell. The red-haired girl also worked part-time at this store. Unfortunately, she spilled 2 bottles of milk. The door to a room nearby immediately opened, and an exasperated store manager appeared on the threshold. He shouted that Qian Dodu was negligent again, and she didn't need this part-time job. A cute girl with big round glasses tried embarrassingly to explain herself to the manager, but he didn't want to listen to her. The manager came closer to the girl and looked into her frightened face. He smiled gloatingly and asked what to do with her. The girl roared and apologized. She was ready to pay for the damaged goods so that she would not be fired. The store manager said that he would deduct half of this month's salary. In addition, Dudu needs to go to his office. The man informed her that there was something else they needed to talk about. The girl stood with her head down, feeling guilty. Ling Tian glared at the arrogant manager. It was very unfair to deprive the girl of half of her salary. The manager turned to him and huffed that he would cut the young man's wages in half too if he worked slowly. Lin Tian immediately turned his back to the cash register, pretending to be busy working. The manager slammed the door. A tearful Chandodu apologized to the young man, wiping away her tears. Because of her, the manager had given the boy a beating. Ling Yatian stroked the girl's head and said that they were both students and should help each other. Dudu immediately brightened up. She embarrassedly said that she would go to the manager's office first and then invite him to dinner after work. Ling Tian almost cried from happiness. This angelic creature Qian Du was definitely sent by the heavens. At that moment, the manager opened the door of his office with his back, inviting the girl to come in. He smiled wryly. Du sat down on a chair and fearfully asked the manager what he needed. She asked him not to fire her. She would get better. The manager shouted that her fate was in her own hands. Everything depended on how well she understood everything. The girl was frightened. She couldn't believe that the store manager was capable of such an abomination and was taking advantage of the fact that she needed a job. Ling Tian couldn't give the defenseless girl to be torn apart and decided to save her. All he had to do was snap his fingers. At the same second, a cash register whistled through the air. The manager was too late to see the danger. The cash register hit the back of the man's head with such force that it knocked him to the ground. The manager suffered a painful blow to his chin. The man slowly got up from the floor and angrily shouted that for such shenanigans, Lin Tian would be immediately fired. The young man smiled and replied that there was no need to scare him. He didn't mind quitting. He had had enough of working here. The angered manager angrily exclaimed that Lin Tian was fired. He demanded that he leave the premises immediately. Ling Tian was genuinely surprised. He said that the store manager had clearly misunderstood something. The young man exclaimed that the store manager had actually been fired. The store is now owned by the young man. The manager said in astonishment that it was quite impossible. He would have to buy the whole store to do it. Lin Tian took the frightened Qian Dodo's hand and suggested that the manager just call back and clarify the information. The man looked at the young man incredulously and called the shareholders. The conversation was short. The manager spoke as politely as possible. While the manager was busy talking on the phone, Lin Tian smiled at the girl and winked cheerfully at her. The young man turned to the manager, who had hung up the phone, and asked if he had any more questions. The manager stood at his desk with his head bowed. He thought hard about what this could mean and how to teach the boy a lesson. He quickly straightened up and threw the wall clock at the young man. Ling Tian ducked his head with a smile, and the clock shattered against the wall. The manager angrily wailed that Lin Tian was trying to cheat him. He had just called the shareholders. The store is not for sale. Lin Tian was genuinely surprised. He hadn't expected that the manager would go so far as to personally call the shareholders. The young man laughed and said that he hadn't asked the store manager to call the company's shareholders at all. The manager got angry and shouted that Lin Tian was trying to make a fool of him. He asked who he should call. Lin Tian handed over a doubled-folded piece of paper and asked the manager to call back this number. The manager said he would turn him into the police if he didn't get a satisfactory response this time too. The store manager dialed the number given to him and said hello politely. He decided to clear the air. All the while, the young man held his silver smartphone in his hand, expecting an important call any minute now. As soon as his phone rang, Lin Tian gave a sly smile and immediately picked up the phone. This was supposed to be fun. The young man laughed. After answering the phone, he said hello to the store manager and informed him that his name was Lin Tian. The manager turned angrily to the young man. The young man's antics were beginning to irritate him, and he should be dismissed immediately. Lin Tian had a calm look on the manager's face. He faintly smiled, happy that the joke had succeeded. The enraged manager shouted that Lin Tian was playing with him again and grabbed the first thing that came to hand. He swung the massive piece of machinery and shouted that the young man had had enough of him. He would kill him for all this abuse. Suddenly there was a roar of machinery and a great rumble. The store shook like an earthquake. Due to the violent shaking, the store manager dropped a heavy object from his hands. In addition, his wig had fallen to the side. Ling Tian smiled with a full mouth and admitted that he really didn't buy the building of the store. He put his foot on the bucket of the excavator driving into the wall of the store. Lin Tian reported that he had just bought this piece of land. Dumbfounded by the news, the former store manager remained silent. Lin Tian jumped into the bucket of the excavator. After climbing up to the heights, the young man shouted from there that from now on the Tian Ling Company's office would be located here. The man couldn't believe his eyes. This student only pretended to be a beggar and was actually quite rich. Lin Tian put on his dark glasses and took out a large bottle of carbonated Coke. He ordered the workers to demolish the building. The man watched with regret as his favorite store turned into ruins before his eyes. It was the end of a career. Lin Tian smiled and told Qian Du that she was a student of the construction high school. Du looked at the young man in surprise. It was true, she had said so herself. The girl nodded, not understanding what the question was about. Smiling, Ling Tian extended his hand to the girl and offered to join his team as an architect. This was how 11% of the task was completed. Miss Chen sat in her office with her arms folded across her chest. She told Lin Tian that she absolutely understood everything now. The teacher guessed that the man who made her famous was the owner of the company she signed a contract with. Ling Tian surprisingly reported that he didn't even try to hide it. Sooner or later she would match those names. He smiled and said that he was the owner of the company. Chen got angry and asked him to confess that his father owned the company. Ling Tian immediately stopped smiling. Of course, Miss Chen didn't believe him and thinks that he has a rich family. Chen glumly said that she had ascertained that his father's money was indeed a lot, so she had to tell him something. This was an absolute untruth. In fact, Ling Tian's father despised money and only kept money to live on. Miss Chen stated that she wanted to warn the young man as a teacher despite working for his father. It turned out that the young man's social practice was almost zero. Miss Chen said it won't go on like this. She continued to criticize Ling Tian further. Chen reproached the young man for the fact that he could eat normally. Ling Tian remembered with some regret that last month he barely had enough for a bowl of rice and a bottle of water. Showing 2 fingers, the teacher stated that with such capabilities, Ling Tian should dress decently. This was also not true. As a poor student, Ling Tian walked around in ragged clothes and Vietnamese shoes. Ling Tian almost cried when he remembered that he had ruined his underwear while doing laundry. He had accidentally washed it along with his jeans. Releasing her 3rd finger, Miss Chen stated that Ling Tian didn't need money and he didn't have to go to work. Tears came to the young man's eyes. He had just fired his boss yesterday, so he really didn't have to go to work. The teacher said that in that case, Ling Tian should spend more time on social practice and earn points. A young man reported that he recently found a construction site for his company's building. He needs to go there and move the bricks. Miss Chen realized that Ling Tian just wanted to avoid the conversation. She wished him good luck and blushed with embarrassment. Ling Tian politely said goodbye to the teacher and stated that he had to get ready for work. Time was of the essence. Miss Chen shouted in the background that the young man must definitely make time for social practice. Otherwise, he wouldn't get his diploma. Ling Tian was no longer listening to his teacher. He ran as hard as he could down the corridor. It was a pity that the girl didn't believe him. Zhang Hao still couldn't forgive the young man for his precipitous fall and watched him surreptitiously. He listened to every word the teacher and students said, and was happy to know that Ling Tian might not get his diploma. Zhang Hao smiled gloatingly and told himself that he would take revenge on the young man. Ling Tian wouldn't be able to get the points he needed. Zhang Hao took out his cell phone and called his father. Without much introduction, the young man said that he was short of money. Chairman Zhang Dajing listened to his son in silence and hung up the phone. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do to help him. The man in the solid suit smiled and said it was the father's responsibility to give his son money if he wanted to spend it. Chairman Jiang was covered in sweat. He tried to pretend that everything was normal and said that the money was worthless. The interlocutor smirked and reminded him that Jiang's own funds had recently been frozen and he had nowhere to get money for his son. The chairman turned black and asked where he got that information. This guy knew too much and could be dangerous. Smiling, the young man said that Jiang had secretly divorced his wife and could take his reserves. Jiang's body shook with anger. The chairman raised his head and shouted at the young man. He assumed that the young man was collecting a dossier on him. The young man smirked and handed over a business card. He advised me to think about it and take him up on his offer before it was too late. Carelessly tossing the business card on the floor, the young man said that something might suddenly happen to Jiang's restaurant. The chairman barely rose from his chair and reached for the young man's business card with a trembling hand. It was nothing special, an ordinary white card with the name of a young man named Dafan Pai on it. Lin Tian was directly involved in the construction of his company's building. He wore a yellow helmet and carried bricks tirelessly. Sweat poured off the young man in hailstones. Wiping his forehead, Ling Tian told himself that carrying bricks was great for relaxation. Qian Dodu came in with 2 huge bags filled with lunchboxes and called everyone over for lunch. Lin Tian took his turn and suggested that today's lunchbox would contain a chicken leg. Dodu stepped closer to him and held out the lunchbox. She was happy to please the boss and brought the lunch personally. The young man covered his eyes in pleasure and reached for the coveted package of food. He said he shouldn't call him boss. They were all like family here. Suddenly, someone's hand overtook him and brazenly snatched the lunchbox out of his hands. It happened very quickly, and the young man didn't immediately realize what was happening. Ling Tian turned around and asked why the man had taken the lunchbox without a line. The man was taller by 2 heads. He frowned and asked what the young man was dissatisfied with. The man showed Lin Tian a huge fist and advised him to be an obedient boy, or else there would be trouble. Qian Dodo started to protest and wanted to tell him that the person he was insulting was a director of the company. The man exclaimed with interest that he had not seen the girl before and asked if she would like to chat with him later. Ling Tian turned purple with anger. He could barely restrain himself from beating the insolent man right now. Suddenly, someone politely but firmly placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. This distracted Ling Tian slightly. Turns out his acquaintance was trying to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Now they couldn't mess with that guy. Ling Tian asked in surprise, wondering what was the matter. There wasn't a single reason why the young man shouldn't be punished. The young man with purple hair leaned closer and quietly said that man's past was gang-related. The muscular man turned around and asked what they were whispering about. He threatened to beat them up, but suddenly the phone rang. The man took the phone out of his pocket and stared at the screen for a long time, a little hesitant about whether to pick it up. He promised to deal with the young men after he returned and left with the phone in his hand. The guys were watching the sturdy man. He was acting a little suspicious, so Lin Tian decided to follow him. The other young man tried to talk him out of it and said they could have their wages deducted if they were caught. Lin Tian laughed and replied that he was the biggest boss here, and it was actually that guy who was in trouble. Ling Tian left following the shoulder man, while his acquaintance kept pondering over his words about the boss. Meanwhile, a stooped man approached the young man in the dark corner and called him Shan Ya. He asked what he could do for him today. The distance was quite long. Lin Tian only made out that Shan Ya had sent his men to the construction site. The young man realized that something bad was being plotted on the set, and that large man was involved. Ling Tian left the hideout, pondering along the way that things had gone badly wrong. Xiao Li can't help. She is undergoing therapy. Meanwhile, the young man with purple hair was surrounded by a group of men. He took a fighting stance, but there were 4 opponents. The young man shouted at the top of his voice, urging Lin Tian to return. Chan Dodo watched the events fearfully. One of the men kicked the boy in the stomach and said that he could not fight back. The second man punched him in the face and accused the young man of lying. The third grinned and grabbed the shovel. He wondered if it would hurt the young man to hit him with the shovel. The young man obediently awaited his fate. He knew that he had nowhere to run. Chan Dodo cried out in fear. She didn't want to see this. Just when the reprisal seemed imminent, there was a sudden and violent rumble. A column of dust rose, and nothing could be seen. A large yellow bus appeared behind the bandits. It stopped a few meters away from the man with the shovel. Lin Tian leaned out of the window and asked if the man would be hurt if he was suddenly hit by a bus. The man was scared to death and immediately threw away the shovel and sat down near the bus, begging for mercy. Ling Tian walked over to him, carelessly shoving his hands into his pockets and frowning, asking if he was the one causing trouble here. Stammering, the man replied that Lin Tian simply did not suspect who their boss was and thus was not afraid. The young man bent over to pick up the shovel and informed them that he didn't really care about their boss, whoever he was. The man angrily remarked that he couldn't remember such an occasion, that their boss Shan Ya had lost his face so much that he was no longer feared. A man in ultra-modern brown shoes made of rare leather leisurely approached the interlocutors. The shoes belonged to Shan Ya, a richly dressed fashionista. The muscular man came with him to put an end to the argument. Lin Tian and Shan Ya recognized each other immediately. The young man's jaw was still sore from the blow he had received. Tian looked at him silently. Finally, he laughed in a friendly manner and remarked that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. Now it was clear to him that it was Shan Ya who wanted to intimidate him. Shan Ya felt a shiver. His knees started to buckle on their own. He fearfully asked what Lin Tian was doing here. The young man smirked and advised Shan Ya to leave the site amicably. Otherwise, he might accidentally get shoveled. The verger intervened in the conversation and angrily asked what right Lin Tian had to behave so disrespectfully to Shan Ya. Ling Tian laughed and assumed that the muscular man also belonged to Shan Ya's circle of good acquaintances. The man narrowed his eyes and somberly informed him that they hung out together and there was no one in the neighborhood who dared cross their path. Suddenly, someone hit him on the head from behind. He could not take such blows, and the man only grudgingly adjusted his helmet. The big man turned around and shouted angrily that someone had had enough of life since they dared to hit him on the head with a stick. Suddenly, his hostile expression disappeared. Now the man himself looked like a frightened, hunted animal. Right behind him was a short old woman. Leaning on a crutch, she stared at the man. The woman pulled his ear and the menacing boy suddenly fell to his knees and roared. He asked his mother what she was doing here. The woman was angry. In fact, it was not her who was fed up with life, but this rascal, and he must be punished immediately. She began hitting her son on the back with a crutch, saying that with a son like that, she should have died a long time ago. In her son's words, the woman said that she was not afraid of him at all. She knocked off his helmet and beat him on his bald head with the palm of her hand. The Amble was on his knees and in tears. Sobbing, he begged his mother to forgive him for the insult. The woman walked over to Lin Tian. She was very glad that the young man had brought her here. Otherwise, her son would have made a big mistake. Ling Tian smiled. He had a scarlet tie tied around his neck. He said that he liked helping people. The woman took the negligent son away by the ear. Lin Tian told Shan Ya that it was now okay to talk normally. The young man was still trembling with fear. Stammering, he admitted that he had been asked to do so. He would leave the site now. Lin Tian stopped Shan Ya. He said that he needed a favor too. The young man asked Shan Ya to tell him about his employer. Shan Ya roared. Sobbing, he tried to evade and said he couldn't tell. There were unwritten rules. Lin Tian didn't hesitate for long. He handed Shan Ya a cellophane bag full of bank bundles of money. Shan Ya took the package without delay. He still felt guilty and didn't want to talk about who had hired him. Lin Tian knew from personal experience that it was only a matter of the amount of money. He handed the young man 2 more of the same bags. Shan exclaimed that guy's name was Zhang Hao and added that it was unwise of him to go against Lin Tian. Lin Tian smiled and praised the young man for being accommodating. Anyway, the mafia is simply a service industry. The young man smiled and told Shan that the latter had the right connections, and he himself was busy with a grand project. Ling Tian moved closer to Shan and started telling him details in his ear. Shan was surprised at the scope of the project. After hearing Lin Tian's demand, Chao Biluo blushed and exclaimed as she stood up from the table that she wouldn't go for it. The young man frowned at the girl and said a little louder that she had no right to disobey her boss's order. The girl blushed even more. She was breathless with anger. Biluo stated that Tian couldn't make her do it. Ling Tian smiled and said that the guests only wanted to play with her and the girl needed to receive them well. Biluo turned red with anger. She shouted that she had the best opinion of the young man, and he dared to offer her such a thing. Ling Tian stood up from the table and walked towards the door, reminding him of the penalties in case of a breach of contract. The young man laughed gloatingly and said that a breach of contract would cost the girl a very large sum of money. Chao Biluo shouted that Lin Tian was being disgusting and started to pull the weighty shoe off her foot. The shoe hit the closed door with a clatter. Tian laughed and asked him to come back tomorrow without being late. The girl's patience is wearing thin. No more humiliation. She shouted at the top of her voice and called out to her faithful servant Wu Dalan. The old man immediately appeared at the girl's side. With a slight tilt of her head, Chao Biluo pressingly demanded to ask for help. Wu Dalan turned pale. He felt that it was better not to do this, and tried to talk the girl out of doing something rash. Biluo shouted that no one else could help them. Da Fan Pai is the only person in the world who is not interested in money. Wu Dalan fell to his knees and asked Madame to think hard. He really didn't want to be in his brother's debt. Biluo became angry and angrily asked since when did Wu Dalan dare to speak to her like that. Turning away from the man, the girl wailed that he only had 1 hour to bring his brother to her. Exactly 1 hour later, Da Fan Pai was sitting at a table in a coffee shop owned by Chao Biluo along with the surrounding buildings. The young man smiled politely and said that he had wanted to meet Her Highness Chao Biluo for quite some time now. The girl returned the favor and said that Da Fan Pai's name resounded throughout the area like the sound of thunder. Fan Pai smiled and countered that people actually give him reputation and he just takes advantage of it. Biluo couldn't wait to get to the point. She began to talk quickly about why she had asked to meet with her. Fan Pai put his finger to his lips and asked the girl to be quiet for a while. He needs to take a look first. His eyes lit up with red lights. The young man said he wanted to see the deepest secret in her heart. Chao Biluo looked at her interlocutor in surprise. She was not quite sure what the young man meant. After penetrating into the depths of Biluo's mind, the young man saw a red car smashed and smoking. A girl was sobbing beside it. That day, many bad men tried to put their paws on the little defenseless girl. They were all local hooligans armed with bats and sticks. Little Cow was barely a foot taller than them. But the survival instinct did its job. The girl knocked them down with her own tools and finished them off with bricks. This gave her some time, enough time to escape from the pursuit. The bullies never caught up with her. Fan Pai said he was interested in her story. He made it clear that he knew all about the loss of Cow's parents and her life on the streets. Biluo blushed. She didn't tell anyone about it. Chow asked how Fang Pai found out about it. The young man raised his head and smiled. Yes, he now knew absolutely everything about Chao Biluo. He said that the girl was indebted to him. Biluo looked at him in surprise, still not believing such luck. She asked if Fan Pai was willing to help her. Fan Pai laughed out loud. He assumed that all he was required to do was to deal with Lin Tian. Fan Pai smiled and revealed that he had many people just begging him to do this. He himself was curious to see a strong opponent. It was evening. The large wall clock struck 7 times. The built-in electronic clock kept up with the movement. Chao Biluo sat at a table with cakes and pastries. She resented having to receive guests. There was better things to do. She was more than happy to put bottles of alcohol on this table. The girl waved her head in different directions. She decided that Da Fan Pai would do everything, and Lin Tian wouldn't be able to resist him. They had stocked up on intercoms beforehand. The girl went to the balcony and told Fan Pai that she had everything ready. The young man was downstairs outside the posh restaurant together with Zhang Hao. Upon hearing the girl's readiness, he smiled. Fan Pai asked Jiang to detain Lin Tian for a while, and pulled his white gloves tighter. Jiang Hao bowed to his mentor and promised Fan Pai to do whatever was required of him. As soon as Jiang Hao left, Fan Pai furtively took out a telescope and whispered to himself that he would find out all of his secrets. Lin Tian, humming a song carefree, was approaching the main entrance of Mr. X's European cuisine restaurant. At the very entrance, he bumped shoulders with Jiang Hao and looked at him in surprise. Jiang turned to Lin Tian. Lin Tian turned around and disdainfully asked what he could do to help the student with the bald spot glitter. The young man proudly replied that his name was Zhang Hao, and he was interested in why Lin Tian had come to eat at this restaurant. Ling Tian replied that this matter was completely none of his business and waved goodbye. Zhang became angry. His face turned purple with anger. Zhang Hao angrily exclaimed that he had not finished yet. There was a conversation to be had. Ling Tian unhappily turned around and indignantly inquired what else Zhang Hao wanted to ask. The young man proudly exclaimed that the restaurant belonged to his family and he could order a private table to be prepared. Lin Tian informed him that there was no need to do so. It would be enough for Zhang Hao to bring him the bill after dinner. Zhang Hao was pounding with anger. He couldn't stand it and shouted that Lin Tian was breaking the generally accepted laws. With his shouting, the young man attracted the attention of all the restaurant customers who were at the entrance. Lin Tian contemptuously folded his arms on his chest. He smiled and asked him to tell him exactly where he had broken the law. Zhang Hao pointed his hand and said that his company's streamers were hosting guests in that room, and that was human trafficking. Ling Tian scratched the back of his head in surprise and asked to see the proof after all. He was conducting his business honestly. Zhang Hao went to the room and declared that he didn't believe his words. He said that Shan Ya had told him about Lin Tian's plans. Ling Tian only smiled at him. Zhang Hao ran to the door and opened both of its flaps. A bright light streamed out of the room. Zhang Hao froze at the threshold. This was not the turn of events he had expected. Now the young man understood what kind of guests he was talking about. Chao Li Bo sat at the table surrounded by a good dozen kids. Enjoying the feast, they all wanted to play with the girl. Ling Tian slowly walked up to Zhang Hao and confidently clapped him on the shoulder. Tian smirked and asked if there were any more questions. Zhang Hao turned around and incredulously asked who these children were. He didn't want to accept the fact that they were his guests. Ling Tian turned to look at his opponent. He grudgingly fiddled and asked what was so bad about it. There were no violations here. Ling Tian was absolutely right. The enraged Zhang Hao shouted that the young man had mistreated him and left. Ling Tian walked into the room and exclaimed that no one could receive these kids better than the charming princess Chao Biluo. The girl was very pleased to hear such flattering words about herself. Chao Biluo couldn't stand it and burst into tears. Meanwhile, Da Fan Pai decided that it was time to find out what was going on in the Zhang family's restaurant, so he put up his telescope. To his surprise, the guy could see his ward Biluo perfectly, but he couldn't recognize the young man. His entire silhouette was reflected in the form of a binary code. Ling Tian and Chao Biluo were standing at the open window of a restaurant in the late afternoon. The young man asked what was troubling her. Bowing her head and turning away so that Lin Tian couldn't see her embarrassed face, the girl admitted that she was wrong. Already outside, the young man was finishing the delicious cake. He grudgingly noticed that Biluo had allowed the thought that Lin Tian had inclined her to do unpleasant things. Chao Biluo blushed like a boiled cancer again and shouted resentfully that it was the young man's own fault. He didn't clarify this point. Ling Tian smiled and said that today she was hosting for free, but tomorrow he might as well pay for it. While waiting for the bus, Lin Tian thought about the fact that the hardest part of his assignment was setting up the company and finding employees. Suddenly, some large man bumped into Lin Tian with his shoulder. It was unexpected, and the young man realized that he had been thinking too hard. Da Fan Pai politely apologized and asked the young man if he was badly bruised. Ling Tian smiled and replied that it was fine. Lin Tian stepped into the bus that pulled up. Chao Biluo looked back at her ally with surprise. He was smiling mysteriously. Unlike Biluo, with Lin Tian, the young man could only count one figure, 11%. He didn't know what it meant. Da Fan Pai had never encountered such a phenomenon before, so Lin Tian was simply intrigued by his mystery. As he was seeing off the bus with his gaze, Zhang Hao walked over and asked what they could do about the situation. Da Fan Pai smiled and reported that there was no need to engage Tian. It was enough to disarm his men. That same day, the phone rang in Miss Chen's office. The girl was busy preparing for class and didn't answer it right away. As it turned out, it was Dr. Dan who called. Miss Chen was very happy to talk to him and asked how her father was feeling. Suddenly, the doctor fell silent, and his voice could no longer be heard. The unfamiliar man suggested that Chen part ways with Lin Tian. Qian Dodu didn't waste any time either. In her spare time, she was constantly preparing for classes. When Dodu's landlord called, the girl happily said that she was ready to pay a month's rent even now. The unfamiliar man leisurely spoke into the receiver and made it clear that the girl had better forget about her contract with Lin Tian. Chao Biluo, unlike the first two girls, could afford to stay in bed for days. That's where she got the call. Biluo chewed off some of the sweet bun and cheerfully introduced herself. She was in a very good mood. When she was threatened with reprisal over the phone, the girl seriously thought about it. Yes, it would be safer not to communicate with Lin Tian. Chao Biluo replied to the interlocutor that she accepts his proposal. She will break the contract with Lin Tian. This was a very unpleasant situation for the young man. Biluo wondered how he would get out of it this time. Ling Tian was indeed very anxious. He walked in circles around the room and scratched the back of his head in a puzzled manner. It was like everyone was conspiring. The young man slammed his hand down on the desk in anger. None of the employees picked up the phone. Moreover, there were all 3 contracts on the table with weighty bundles of money. All of his female employees had quit without giving a reason. As a result, the completion rate dropped from 11% to 3%. We had to start all over again. At this moment, the phone lying on the table rang. Lin Tian didn't care about calling right now. He wanted to get the company back. The young man reluctantly picked up the phone and was surprised to learn that tonight was the final part of the auto race. The assignment was to win with the same car as the first time. Lin Tian was hoping for a solid prize. Suddenly, someone knocked annoyingly on the door of the room. Lin Tian was no longer expecting anyone. All the female employees had scattered. He went to the door and asked suspiciously what the guest wanted. It turned out to be a visitor, and the young man opened the door. It was Defan Pai in person. The young man asked if Tian Lin Company was here. He was here for an interview. Lin Tian had already forgotten that he had just recently posted a job advertisement. He invited the guest to come inside. Fan Pai scanned the young man. He was quite surprised that that figure had significantly decreased since the last time he had met him. Fan Pai smiled gloatingly and thought that in any case, Tianlin would be unfortunate at the end of today's race. At midnight, the race organizer gathered all the participants and announced that this time, the route would be longer than the previous one. From the center of the city, it is to go east for the marker, and from there rush to the west side of the city without delay. Lin Tian told the driver that he had heard about this format of racing before. The participants don't lose anything in any case. Each participant chooses their own route. The winner receives membership in the Divine Heroes Club. The organizer laughed and showed a stack of contracts. The losers will have to give away the most valuable thing they have. Ling Tian immediately stopped smiling. He indignantly squealed that no one had told him this before. An attendant came to the starting area and held up a large checkered black and white flag and asked the participants if they were ready. Lin Tian told the driver that he was counting on him very much. His company is small, but he can't give it up. Xiao Li was still in rehabilitation, so Lin Tian hired Shan Ya as his driver. The young man smiled and promised to try his best. He didn't actually intend to win the final race for Lin Tian. Shan Ya imagined how angry he would be at the end. The race director waved the racing flag. The final race for membership in the Divine Heroes Club began. Su Shuiqing's white sports car was significantly faster than everyone else, and the girl had no problem taking the lead. The final of the competition was very popular and was broadcast live. The commentator reported that the Queen of the Night was in the lead. A helicopter with cameras was circling over the race site. The reporter said that this time there were many people at the race trying to take away the championship. The girl cheerfully reported that the Queen of the Night lost to one man in the preliminary race. His car had been modified by God. The camera turned toward the yellow bus, which was traveling in the usual city mode. The commentator didn't know what to say. To fill the growing awkward pause, the girl smiled at the millions of viewers and suggested a tortoise and hare strategy. Ling Tian leaned back comfortably in his chair. Shan Ya smiled slightly and reported that their vehicle was too slow. Ling Tian winked at the driver and said that there was nothing to worry about. He already had everything planned out long ago. He took out his phone, dialing the emergency number. Ling Tian said that he wanted to call the police, but no one answered the call, and the smile disappeared from his face. Ling Tian looked at the phone screen perplexedly. It turned out that there was no communication signal in this area of the city. Shan Ya triumphantly thought that he was the one who had it all planned out. Thanks to him, the whole city would be out of communication today. Ling Tian thought for a bit and said that he would now have to go to Plan B called super acceleration. At one of the intersections, Lin Tian demanded to turn in a completely different direction and pointed to the left with his hand. Shan Ya obediently turned the bus around and confusedly said that this road leads to the south of the city. They don't need to go there. Ling Tian faintly smiled and said that they would only be able to get a good acceleration with a detour. At the control point of the eastern part of the city, the outline was illuminated red from afar. It was impossible to miss. Zhang Hao laughed gloatingly. His nemesis had a bus that was too slow. There was no way he could fix his situation. One of the race administrators stood near the checkpoint and took a reading. Zhang Hao was the first to arrive at the spot and extended his hand. Suddenly, something very much like a snowflake fell on his hand. The young man was very surprised. As far as he knew, it doesn't snow in summer. As it turned out, he was wrong. It was snowing outside the window. Zhang Hao involuntarily shrank back, wearing only a t-shirt. There was a great roar of jet engines outside, and the young man turned around. The strong light of the headlights blinded his eyes. It turned out that 3 jets were flying right above him and spraying snow and ice. A yellow bus was rushing along this pavement. From a technical point of view, Lin Tian had really planned everything and equipped the bus with powerful skis beforehand. Sticking out the window, he molded a round snowball and cheerfully declared that it was very easy to accelerate the bus by rolling it in the snow. Ling Tian enjoyed looking at his opponents who couldn't handle the controls. The driver of the blue car did not calculate the braking distance and crashed into the pole. The other cars were already hitting the blue sports car. Jiang Hao left the car and cried out to the heavens in his heart, tears flowing. He couldn't understand why he was being punished like this. At this moment, the jet swept right over Jiang Hao's head, spraying snow in his face. The young man raised his head, looking at the airplanes. They were flying so low that they illuminated everything around them with powerful searchlights. Lin Tian said in a satisfied voice that the secret to his acceleration was very simple. It was enough to create an artificial snowfall. Shan'ya now didn't understand the young man's logic at all. He had bypassed the city through the southern part just to reach the control point. In fact, Lin Tian had prepared for this thoroughly. At the airfield, he ordered the snow to be delivered by any means necessary, saying that there was enough money. Pointing to the powerful tracks, the young man bought himself one for the bus. He demanded to wait for his signal, and then start snowing. Shan'ya was just amazed at such a crazy waste of money. He wasn't sure the company was worth the investment. Shan'ya informed Lin Tian that the supply of snow in the airplanes was completely depleted, and so there would be no more snow. He suggested that with the financial ability to do so, just go to the office and bribe the judge. That would be much more effective. In this case, Shan'ya's men would catch the young man in the act, and he would instantly lose his reputation and money. Ling Tian laughed and said that he would not be embarrassed. There was nothing to worry about. He should just rush to the northern part of the city. This was something Shan'ya could no longer understand. There was no point in going straight to the city center. It was impossible to win. Lin Tian smiled and winked at the driver. Unlike Shan'ya, the young man was absolutely confident in his victory. Shan'ya frowned. Of course, Lin Tian was acting completely illogical, but he had managed to win the race last time. In addition, Lin Tian was constantly pushing him, reminding him to behave in a showy manner on his first day on the job. Shan'ya had no choice but to press the pedal to the floor. The bus rushed past the sign for the northern part of the city. A helicopter with reporters circled near the finish line. The competitors had only a few miles to go. From the great height, the first group of riders could be clearly seen approaching. The only strange thing was that the Queen of the Night was not among them. Su Shuiqing was actually just being cautious. She knew that Ling Tian would not compete fairly. However, there were several other cars traveling in front of the girl. Apparently, they too did not fall into the young man's trap. Shuiqing decided that she could no longer be threatened at this stage and activated the nitrogen acceleration system. The acceleration was so powerful that the car literally took off. In a matter of seconds, the girl was ahead. The broadcast girl joyfully exclaimed that the Queen of the Night was just conserving her strength. As a champion, she would definitely win. Suddenly, there was a loud, long horn of an approaching train, and Su Shuiqing turned pale. She didn't have time to skip. The commentator clapped her hands together in frustration. She was sincerely rooting for the Queen of the Night, and this express was very unfortunate. Su Shuiqing realized too late that she was trapped just before the finish line. Her car skidded at high speed. Barely leveling the snow-white car, the girl slowed down. The fact that the train appeared just now was suspicious. Su Shuiqing realized that the train was also part of Lin Tian's plans. The only thing that made her happy was that she had been ahead of everyone until now. Seeing that the girl had stopped, Ling Tian cockily showed her tongue and cheerfully shouted that he had met his girlfriend. Su Shuiqing glared angrily at her opponent. Unfortunately, there was nothing she could do to him right now. They were on opposite sides of the railroad tracks, and the yellow bus was slowly driving parallel to the train. Lin Tian cheerfully said that every successful man is silently supported by a woman, and in his case, it was Susu. Lin Tian was in a great mood. He stated that similar to the name Night Snow, his car was called Day Ice. It was only a short distance to the finish line, its green lights visible from afar. The young man ordered the transformation of the bus. The skis on the front wheels of the bus unhooked and turned into some sort of small springboard. Lin Tian commanded to give the vehicle full acceleration, and the bus flew into the air. The young man put his face out the window and smiled. Su Shuiqing looked sadly at the departing bus. Breaking cars with a train was too steep even by her standards. However, the battle was not lost. The girl understood perfectly well that Lin Tian had nothing else but the train trick. But she herself had an exclusive trump card. Su Shuiqing removed the top decorative cover from the steering wheel of the car. Beneath it exposed a large button built into the steering column for the most urgent of emergencies. It was time to transform the Night Snow car. In a matter of seconds, wheels and wings began to fly off of it. When all unnecessary parts were jettisoned like ballast, the vehicle was transformed into a sport bike. This modification had its own name, the Night Snow of the 11th model. Being a bike, It had the performance of a sports car. On a flat stretch of track, he had no equal. The girl knew she could easily win the second stage of the race with acceleration. Da Fan Pai slowly drove the bus. He was surprised at the idea of slowing down the participants with a high-speed train. It was completely incomprehensible how Lin Tian could think of such a thing. Fan Pai began to suspect that he was not human. Lin Tian looked out the window with an absent look. After thinking about it, he said that there were no peaches at all, which was sad. Suddenly, in the rearview mirror, the young man saw Su Shui-ching. She leaned forward as much as possible to improve the streamlining of the bike. She wasn't interesting to look at in the rearview mirror, so Lin Tian leaned out of the window and turned around. The girl shouted that she guessed his traps, so she came up with her plan. This time she would beat him. As the bike whizzed past, Lin Tian gave the girl an appraising look and shouted that Susu was wearing black again today. Da Fan Pai didn't understand what the young man meant. He puzzledly tried to understand where Lin Tian saw the color black. In addition, the young man was a little worried about the speed of the bus. He asked Lin Tian if they would speed up. Lin Tian had just pulled out his chopsticks and took out a vegetable salad. He smiled and said that there was no need for that. They had already won. Su Shui-ching rushed along the highway, occasionally glancing at the bus behind her. The last few hundred meters remained. Of course, the champion could not lose the final battle. She crossed the finish line in triumph. The race was over. The race director waved the flag. The reporter was already on the ground and exclaimed joyfully that they already had a winner. Under the enthusiastic shouts of the crowd, Su Shui-ching raised her hand. The reporter shouted that the Queen of the Night had won. Lin Tian slowly approached the motorcycle. The reporter exclaimed that second place wasn't such a bad result. Su Shui-ching pointed her finger at the young man and sternly said that Lin Tian really lost this time. To the girl's surprise, the bus didn't even think about stopping. It drove on leisurely, as if it didn't want to talk to them. The reporter cheerfully suggested that Lin Tian was unable to admit defeat and just wanted to leave the track. At this point, the young man stuck his head out of the window and shouted that it was time to call it a day. He was ready to hand over the money due. A yellow double bus stopped. Several people raced toward it. Everyone wanted to get their share as quickly as possible. One of the runners clanked and snagged a carelessly thrown finish line. It was lying quite nearby. The reporter and Su Shui-ching stood the closest. They were the first to begin to realize what had really happened. The girl was furious. It turned out that Lin Tian was able to hurt her here as well, and shifted the real finish line.